Hello and welcome to the 19th Represents, Building a Caregiving Economy for All. I'm Emily Ramshaw, co-founder and CEO of the 19th, an independent nonprofit newsroom that aims to empower you with the information, resources, and community you need to be equal participants in our democracy. Today, we're pleased to bring you critical conversations on the state of the nation's care infrastructure and the well-being of caregivers. We'll speak to leaders, thinkers, and doers about creating policies and much-needed support networks for family and professional caregivers. If we've learned anything over the past year, it's the vital role caregivers play in our society and economy. When schools and other facilities closed abruptly at the start of the pandemic, many women were forced out of the labor market or stretched to the max to balance care with work. Most professional caregivers never stopped working, despite the risks of COVID-19. Now, with significant federal investment in the workforce, women, and families, will we see this newfound appreciation turn into lasting change? Before we get started, we'd like to thank our founding sponsor, AARP, and our supporting sponsors, Pivotal Ventures and RAND Corporation. Dr. Regina Shi, Program Director at RAND Corporation and board member of the National Alliance for Caregiving, will share a few remarks before we get started.
Thanks, Emily. RAND is pleased to partner with the 19th News, AARP, and Pivotal Ventures for today's Caregiving Summit. The RAND Corporation has been conducting research on childcare, elder care, and long-term care for over 30 years. Our research seeks to promote equity in the critical infrastructure of caregiving. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted many of these inequities. For example, research has shown that between January and September of 2020, the largest net decline in the workforce was among women, and women with 2 children experienced a 3.8 percentage point decline in workforce participation. This historic drop in what was immense progress in women's workforce participation requires expanding childcare affordability. Inequities in family caregiving are also apparent by age and ethnicity. In 2020, the Caregiving in the U.S. study found that the number of family caregivers has increased to 53 million. The picture of caregivers has also changed over the past 5 years so that more young people are providing care, including 23% who are millennials. Hispanic caregivers are the youngest group caring for an adult, and they experience financial impacts more often than non-Hispanic white caregivers. Pay inequities are also rampant. We know that the availability of family caregivers is declining despite the growing need for long-term care. Home care workers are some of the fastest growing occupations. Their employment projection is 34% over 10 years. They are the backbone of formal care in home and community-based settings, yet their median annual wage is only $27,000. Promoting their well-being and working conditions is key to retaining this important workforce. To meet the growing demand for equitable care, RAND is extending our vanguard work on the 5.5 million military caregivers, improving the quality of childcare, and mitigating disparities in access to formal care. A paradigm shift in the way research is conducted requires several considerations. First, with each generation comes complex health and mental health needs. This calls for reimagining the way family caregivers and the formal care workforce function together and how they function together in an equitable way. Second, demographic shifts in the composition of family and formal caregivers requires culturally and linguistically tailored supports. These must be developed through a poverty and racial equity lens to preserve health and financial security. These are priority areas for the RAND Center to Advance Racial Equity Policy. Third, the way our country responds to health threats, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, must be examined for unintended consequences to the most vulnerable communities of care recipients and caregivers. With this renewed national attention to the delivery, infrastructure, and financing of care, data and facts generated by research can promote equity and how we best support our country's critical formal and family caregivers. Please join RAND in our caregiving research agenda by emailing me or visiting www.rand.org/caregiving. Thank you.
A quick reminder that while sponsors help keep the 19th Represents free for viewers to attend, they play no part in the programming of our events. As today's discussions get going, we hope you'll help us spread the word by tweeting and sharing using the hashtag 19th Represents. You can also sign up for our free newsletter at 19thnews.org/subscribe, where you can find out about upcoming 19th News events. Now let's introduce our first panel for a discussion on why the lack of affordable quality childcare is holding back women, families, and the economy. Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro represents Connecticut's 3rd Congressional District and is chair of the House Appropriations Committee. She also chairs the Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health and Human Services and Education, where she oversees the country's investments in education, health, and employment. Congresswoman Barbara Lee was first elected in 1998 to represent California's 9th Congressional District. She's a member of House Democratic leadership and the highest-ranking African-American woman in Congress. Wendy Chun-Hoon is director of the Department of Labor's Women's Bureau, whose mandate is to ensure an equitable recovery for women, women of color, and workers with the least power. Previously, Wendy led Family Values at Work, a national network of grassroots coalitions that have won more than 60 paid leave policies. Leading this conversation is the 19th's economy reporter, Chebeli Carazana.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us today to talk about what I think is really the story of the past year. Never has a year challenged us to look more critically at the support that we offer women in the economy and how failing to do so holds us back as a country. Last April, nearly half of all mothers, were not working as a result of the pandemic and the breakdown of childcare. In September of 2020, 863,000 women left the workforce when the school year started largely virtually across the country. It was childcare, again, that struck there. Even now, more than a year out from the pandemic, women are still struggling to return to the workforce. Some 2 million are still out of work. Many daycare centers remain closed or have not reopened at full capacity. About 1 in 7 childcare workers is still out of work, and those jobs have disappeared since the start of the pandemic. And so it's no surprise how those things are related and how our economy and our recovery is related to childcare. I think it's pretty clear now, and a lot of experts have said, that the pandemic and the recovery cannot begin in full until the pandemic is under control and childcare is reinstated. And so this moment is also an opportunity, I think, to reimagine the way we think about childcare in this country. And so that's why I'm really excited to be joined here by a lot of the folks that have been doing that reimagining for a long time. So I want to start today by really driving home and understanding the impact that childcare has on women, families, and the economy, and why it's not tangential or secondary, but central. At the 19th, we often talk about how our lived experiences help inform our work, how it helps us see where to go. And so I know each of you has been working in this space for a long time, and so I'm hoping you could maybe share a poignant moment for you, whether it was from your own personal experience, working with constituents or a family, something that really helped you understand very viscerally why investing in childcare is an economic imperative for this country. I hope that that'll sort of set the stage for some of the work that you've done. Representative Lee, I hate to put you on the spot as the first one, but I would love to hear from you. You know, you were a single mother raising 2 kids. Can you talk about how that helped you see where the gaps were in the safety net and how that's informed the work that you've done in your career?
Sure, thank you very much. And I'm so honored to be part of this discussion and to be here with my chairwoman, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, is just an added element of excitement and power in terms of her commitment to make sure that childcare is affordable, accessible, paid family leave, making sure that the child tax credit is permanent. So Rosa, Chairwoman DeLauro, it's really wonderful to see you and be with you.
Great to be with you, my friend.
Important conversation. And I'm glad, Chappelle, right, that you talked about reimagining childcare, because even before the pandemic, it was inaccessible, it was unaffordable, and so many women, especially women of color, have never had the ability to access affordable childcare. And so the pandemic just exacerbated this and shone a light on what was taking place. Personal experience, and this goes back to the day, I was on public assistance after a marriage. I got divorced, left with 2 small little boys who are phenomenal young, well, my age now, men. And it was really hard. And I had to go on public assistance, food stamps, Medi-Cal here in California, welfare, and in the midst of all this, I was a college student at Mills College, and I really wanted to finish college because I wanted to be able to, take care of my children, get a master's advanced degree. I was very active in the community, the whole 9 yards, but childcare, I could not afford childcare. I couldn't even afford babysitting. And I had to take my children. I always say my kids know statistics better than I do, because I had to take them to class with me at Mills College. Fortunately, it's a women's college, and I was able to do that. And sometimes when they wanted to leave the classroom, they'd play around. And fortunately, there were young women who helped me look out for them on the campus. And so I was on all of these lists, though, to get into childcare, affordable childcare centers. But these lists were so long. I remember the very first one, Rose Street Childcare Center. It took me 2 or 3 years to just get on the list, to get into the childcare center. And once I got in, of course, it was a sliding scale in terms of the rates. But still, that sliding scale was very difficult for me, because I had other responsibilities. I had to pay for gas to pick them up. I had to find a place to take them if I had night classes. And so it was just a constant juggling back and forth, back and forth. And what happened was I didn't have any money for anything. I was constantly struggling to take care of my kids and to find safe and affordable and good quality childcare. So the lists were too long. The childcare centers weren't available for people like me. And then the cost still with the sliding scale was too much for me to pay. And so finding accessible, affordable childcare for everyone, every woman is extremely important, because that's key to their success, either if they're going to school, whatever they're doing, working, staying in the workplace. Given this pandemic, 5 million women lost their jobs during this pandemic. And so it's key to families, especially single parents, and especially women of color, to their success in terms of getting whatever educational degrees that they want, or finding a job, or going into job training. They can't do this and be productive members of this society and engage in consumer spending and all of the whatever, all of our economic policies in terms of economic growth. They can't participate if they don't have good quality childcare. So it's intersectional, as we say, and it leads to really either a good quality of life for you and your family, or just allows you to hang on and live on the edge if you don't have it. So for me, it's something that we must do, because I don't want anyone to ever go through what I went through.
Thank you, Representative Lee. And I think, a lot of us can attest to the fact that a lot of that has not changed. It's why we're still having this conversation now. Representative DeLauro, I know you've been fighting for this for a long time. Was there a moment for you where it really became critical for you to really chase this and try to find a solution?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, childcare has been really, for such a long time, and particularly for women, and Congresswoman Lee talked about her own experience. I'm sure Wendy has experience as well, that we all do. I was raised in a family where both my folks worked. My dad worked. My mom, because of financial struggle as well, she worked in the old sweatshops in the city of New Haven. She was a garment worker. Fortunately, my grandmother had a pastry store, and that I could, that was really a child care, where I could be with aunts and uncles as a place for me to go. Oftentimes, my mom would have me meet her after school. So after school, I would go to meet her at the dress shop. And I've told the story before, and she would tell me to pursue an education, so I didn't have to work in a sweatshop as well as a garment worker. But it was to rely on family to be able be able for me to have a place to go after school where I would be safe, etc. Now, when families today, women today, who oftentimes rely on family, but you can't always rely on family because something goes wrong in someone's life and they can't take your child. And so you don't know what you're going to do. If you stay out of work, you might lose your job. You don't take a child to work with you. Sometimes you do. You just take them, that just takes them along because they have nowhere else to be. And that's why the need for the system. And I think historically, this goes back, during the Second World War, there was a congresswoman whose name was Mary Norton from New Jersey. She was known, Barbara, as Battling Mary. And she sat on the Labor Committee. And actually, she's responsible for the Fair Standards Labor Act and Wages Act. But she created during the war child care centers nationwide because men were fighting overseas in the war. Women were in the factories. So she had the vision and the foresight to say, let's establish child care centers. And the madness of it all is that they existed from 1943 to 1946. And then when the men came back from the war, they said, we're going back to the jobs. Women don't need this any longer. So we have been struggling on the issue of childcare as a critical ingredient to our economic security for families today. And I believe that today, now, particularly because of the pandemic, we have finally realized that we will not have a thriving economy and women will not be able to participate in the workforce in the ways that they have if we do not have a safe, secure, stabilized childcare industry for now and for the future. And we need to take this moment to build that architecture for the future so that childcare is not at the fringe, but at the center of how our economic engine is being driven.
Thank you for that, Representative DeLauro. And I think that's a great point of context to understand that as a country, we have done this before, and we are at a position now where we're considering how we can do it again. And Wendy, you are especially in a position where this is being discussed at the Department of Labor, and you used to work in advocacy and philanthropy. I'm sure that this is something that's been driven home for you a lot recently in the past few years. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. What a total treat to be in a conversation with these legends. So thank you for all the work that you have led all these years. I mean, part of me wants to say, have you met a mom in the last 15 months? Like we're barely hanging on. I'm glad my kids aren't in here yelling right now. But I think going back a little bit, and I heard this in your voice, Representative Lee, and it caught me for a second, because at the point at which you started saying, and I had to rely on public assistance. The first time I got really mad was paid leave yet, right? And we were not having a conversation about how to robustly fund and provide childcare. We were talking about, got to go to work and barely make it by. And if you earn 25 more cents, you lose your childcare. And that's not the system, right? That's not. So I heard your voice catch and I thought, yeah, I remember that was the first time I got really mad. But the thing that I was thinking about was the first teacher that our youngest had, and her name's Miss Yazzie, and I will forever remember her because not only was she teaching my kid, but she helped us as first-time moms really understand that he was having some challenges, and so she sort of became friend and innovator in helping him figure out how am I going to, overcome these challenges, and how can she helped us as parents figure out a way to overcome those challenges. And then we got pregnant at the same time, and we were giving birth around the same time. And she was asking the same questions, right? How do I get off the list? I was thinking, how do I get off the list? How are we going to get in? And so we faced a lot of the same struggles at the same time. And we were just in two different places. She was our childcare provider, and teacher and friend and mentor. So I think of her a lot.
Well, thank you for that, Wendy. And I think it's a testament to the creativity of women and folks across this country that, we've had to piece it together for lack of childcare for many, many, many years, decades even. And I think this past year, this women's recession has shown us again and again how critical childcare is to a functioning economy. I think there's a lot of people who have argued this moment has made the case really clearly. And yet we're still struggling. We're still struggling to move in the direction that many other industrialized nations have already moved, where they have subsidized, accessible, affordable childcare, both for younger children and older children. And so I wanted to pose this to our lawmakers and hope they could set the stage for us on this, because what I'm wondering is, what is still dividing us as a country on this issue? Representative DeLauro, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. You know, I still think, you know, there are remnants of the view that, you know, it's about public policy. Public policy ought to mirror what families are going through these days. And that has been changing. We are no longer in an environment where women are in the home taking care of children. They're working. And today it's now, you know, mothers, fathers, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, everyone is in the workforce. And so that what then is the public policy initiatives that account for this way of life now. You know, we had a different way of life before now, and that's what hasn't really caught up. That hasn't been internalized. And you get so many people who view it, well, you know, you ought to be able to take care of your kids. You ought to, figure it out. It's not as if, you know, what struck me during the pandemic was that, and it was true, we had an airline industry that was collapsing, just collapsing. And there was an immediately billions of dollars to the airline industry. So it could survive, it could thrive, people could be employed, etc. On the other hand, we found ourselves in the position where at that juncture, because it's changed since then, there was only $13 billion for childcare. $13 billion when we were looking at 60, 70, 80 billion dollars for other industries that were going under, until there was the hue and cry and the fact where just what you talked about, the statistics, Shabelle, about women who are out of work. You know, women who can't go to work. So they're, as I've been saying, they're not opting out of the workforce. They are being pushed out of the workforce. And the realization that that's there. And so how does our public policy meet the need? What is the public policy? It is childcare. It is not a fringe benefit. It is not, you know, for women who just want to go to work and it's a nice thing to do, but they don't have to work. Families, women today are primary breadwinners or secondary breadwinners in their families. They need to be in the workplace. So the lack of that recognition, it doesn't only reflect childcare, it's also true of equal pay for equal work for women. That is another area that is attached to this as well, that somehow these issues that really value the work that women do in our society, in our country. I don't think that has been internalized to the degree that it needs to be, but I do believe that the pandemic has opened the eyes of a lot of people, and this is our moment to help to make that change.
Do you think there are other issues at play as well, Representative Lee?
Sure, I do. And let me just speak to the policy point that Chairwoman DeLauro raised. Now, in the president's plan, the American Families Plan, of course, he's put in, I believe it's $225 billion to make childcare affordable, invest in high quality childcare, and to invest in the childcare workforce. And so it is a policy decision and a policy choice. It really should be a given that we can get bipartisan support for this, because it's not only Democratic women, it's Republican women, independents, all women who need access to childcare so that they can take care of their families, create their own businesses, work, continue working in the workforce or whatever. So it is central. And there's so many barriers in terms of, this is very political if you ask me, and we're trying to get bipartisan support for this. And so part of it has to do with I think the value of the priorities and valuing women and understanding the gender equality and gender equity, there's no option for that at this point. And so a lot of it, I think, has to do with not yet some in this country, especially on the other side, coming to grips with the fact that women are here to stay and insist on equal rights, and will keep fighting it until they're achieved. And so, you know, the politics of it is always played out, but I hope finally we've gotten to the point now where, as we move forward on the President's American Families Plan, that we can have some kind of consensus that that women deserve to have access to affordable childcare, and the childcare workforce, that those in the workforce deserve a fair wage, an increase in the minimum wage, good benefits, good training, so that they can run their own childcare centers or work in the childcare space. And so, yeah, it's a political struggle. That's one of the major barriers, but I think we have an opportunity now to, you know, reduce those barriers, eliminate them, and move forward.
If I could, I know you want to get to Wendy, and Wendy should be in this conversation, but I think it's very interesting. And the point that Congressman Lee was making is, when you think of the debate and the discussion around what is the jobs plan and the American Families Plan, it is, let's look at the jobs plan as traditional infrastructure. The lack of a sense that a thriving childcare industry is not part of the infrastructure of this country is really speaks loud and clear to the debate that we are currently in.
I'm glad you both brought that up, because I want to talk to each of you about what's been proposed, including the Families Plan. So since we're on the Families Plan, let's stay on it for a second. There has been some talk that plan appears to be stalling. It's not clear yet if it's going to pass, if it's going to pass as part of the infrastructure plan, if it's pieces of it are going to pass as individual bills. Is it struggling, Representative Lee, and what parts of the plan are failing to gain support?
I won't say it's struggling. I think that the political dynamics warrant a heck of a lot of debate, discussions, and agreements. I hate to say compromises, because we're not going to compromise on women and children. And so what's taking place, I believe, is the president really trying to make a good faith effort to engage in negotiations so that he can have a bill that both Democrats and Republicans support. And so we have to keep fighting for that, and we have to exercise our political muscle and our organizing strength throughout the country to make sure that the president has the backing for us to be able to pass this plan in a way that ensures that we have the $225 billion for childcare.
Thank you. Wendy, I wanted to ask you about some of the funding that has already started to go out to states. The American Rescue Plan, which was passed in March, allocated $39 billion to childcare, which up until now is a historic amount of money. We have never seen it. And so states are just receiving that money. They are deciding what to do with it. And a lot of them are talking about using it for workforce to help give workers incentives, bonuses, incentives for education, and help bolster a field that is 95% women and largely women of color. A lot of people argue that the key to improving childcare lies there within the workforce. I'm wondering what the Bureau is doing to help with that effort, and particularly since these are one-time funds, and there is a lot of talk about how we can fix this issue long-term.
Yeah. I mean, clearly I share the enthusiasm of our brilliant elected officials here about this being really a once in a generation opportunity. So on that, in terms of the scale, you're right, the American Rescue Plan and the $39 billion is a huge investment. And it's one time, but it has the potential to start to shift some of these things. So, you know, obviously not the Department of Labor or the Women's Bureau, but the Health and Human Services is clearly in the lead here, but you know, really working hand in glove to understand that these things are all mutually reinforcing, right? So you have in the American Rescue Plan signals about the childcare money that is absolutely about multiple populations, not just the childcare workers themselves. That's a huge piece of it. Essential workers who have had to continue to leave the home to go to work every day to serve the rest of our country, and the childcare options that they have or haven't had. The fact that women business owners, so you talked about the childcare workforce being vastly majority, 95% women and largely women of color. There are also on the business side, childcare providers who are the business owners, again, largely women of color who have had to keep their businesses open during this time. So I just wanted to circle, the mutually reinforcing picture here, and the fact that we need to pay attention to outcomes for all of these folks. So what is the Women's Bureau doing? We have been working closely with the Health and Human Services and our counterparts there to really think through and support the advice that they're providing to states, the guidance on how to make sure that, this one-time infusion and the significance of it can go to multiple ends. Make sure that parents have the subsidies that they need and that they know about them and are accessing them to be able to find childcare in this moment and return to work. To make sure that the childcare providers themselves as business owners have the stabilization money to make sure that their workers and their kids in their care are safe and healthy. Make sure that, importantly, there is the option for higher wages, better labor standards, working conditions, training and advancement. So I think very clear guidance coming out from Health and Human Services, and I know that that money is sitting with states right now. Another thing that the Women's Bureau is absolutely doing is continuing to lift up the problem that's in front of us, the challenges, but also getting the word out. So, making sure that we're drawing attention to, I've been thinking about our Secretary Walsh, who has been starting to travel again and is going to childcare centers and really seeing how impactful this money can be. Meeting the workers themselves, meeting the providers, meeting the parents. So really making sure that we are lifting up in a very public way the fact that this money is hitting the street and that it is a huge infusion that should be used to really get to these outcomes. Another thing, last thing I'll mention maybe, is the Women's Bureau and HHS have collaborated on a first of its kind database that we're building out. It is captured data pre-pandemic, but it does provide a baseline by county level on what the childcare costs are. And our intent is to really match that against what have women's labor force participation rates been in those areas, and really make very clear as COVID and the pandemic have already, what the relationship is between the cost of childcare in your hometown, and whether you can or can't afford that, and whether, how that impacts you, your family, your work, your financial stability. So a couple of things.
That's great. And I think, one of the policies that's really going to help drive down that cost is the expansion of the child tax credit, which we saw take place this year. That money is going to start going out to families on July 15th. And Representative DeLauro, I want you to bring us home with this one. There's a lot of policies we could talk about, but I would be remiss to not mention this one. This money is going out and it could cut child poverty in half. Part of that is being able to reach the hardest to reach families, the lowest income families. And I know you're very involved in that effort because that will help determine the success of this program. So if you could sort of tell us a little bit about the work that you are doing to reach those folks so that child poverty could, potentially come down to around 7% versus.
Let me just say, this was an 18-year effort by Congresswoman DeLauro. Okay, I just have to interject that.
Thank you.
And why we can't wait for this next step.
Thank you. And two very quick things. I want to applaud the Women's Bureau, and Congressman Lee knows this, and Wendy knows this, that the Women's Bureau resides in the Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education Subcommittee of Appropriations. And we are going to take good care of the Women's Bureau for the work that they have done. And I want to say something about Congresswoman Lee and also Congresswoman Roybal Allard, who initiated through an amendment to the appropriations bill, a study to look at child poverty, which then was taken up by Columbia University, National Academy of Sciences, and produced a document that says that the child tax credit is the way for us to lift children out of poverty. And we're very, very excited about it because it is also the lifeline to the middle class, but lifts over 55% of kids out of poverty. And now our job, because to meet the July 15th date, when the checks will go out. We're working very, very closely with the IRS to make sure that the portals are open, particularly for non-filers and folks who have to change their family's status, those who have pay taxes and file, they will automatically get the check. They are all set. But just as we did with the economic payments in the last relief package, the IRS is on track to move forward. They are working with over 4,000 community participants and organizations to get the word out. We have the Democratic Caucus did about over 140 events in districts, et cetera, speaking about the child tax credit and just trying to engage people. We are all involved in working with our community organizations to make sure the word gets to children, with our schools to get the flyer out that kids can take home and understand that this is there for them, and they should be able to take advantage of it. That's our goal now. Our second goal is we're going to make the child tax credit permanent because you don't lift kids out of poverty in 1 year, so it has to be made. It has to be made permanent. It is transformative. It really is a new deal for families, and I think we want to give a shout out that we have willing partners in the Biden-Harris administration, and we have the strength of the administration, we have the strength of the Congress, and this will become a reality. And we all believe it is akin to what Franklin Roosevelt did in the New Deal. It is transformative policy, and we're going to make sure everyone who is eligible has that opportunity to get the benefits of a child tax credit.
Well, thank you very much, Representative DeLauro, Representative Lee, Wendy Shanhoon from the Department of Labor. We are really at a transformational moment. There is a lot of opportunity. We are going to be watching very, very closely how all of that unfolds and the work that you are doing. And so it's been a great, great pleasure to be able to be with you all today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Be safe, everyone.
Thank you all so much for starting us off with that important conversation. Now, I'm excited to introduce a performance that will resonate with all the mothers watching. Author and poet Kate Baer earned a #1 New York Times instant bestseller with her first book, What Kind of Woman?, from which she will read a few selected poems for us today. Her next book, I Hope This Finds You Well, will be released this November.
Motherlode. She keeps an office in her sternum, the flat bone in the center of her chest, with all its urgent papers, vast appointments, lists of minor things. In her vertebrae, she holds more carnal tasks: milk jugs, rotten plants, heavy-bottomed toddlers, and all their mortal rage. She keeps frustration in her hallux, senseless chatter, jealous fangs, the spikes of a dinosaur's tail. The belly is more complicated, all heartache and ambition, fires and tidal waves. In her pelvis, she holds her labors, long and slippery. In her clavicle, silent things: money and power, safety and choice, tiny banquets of shame. In her hands, she carries their egos, small and flimsy. In her mouth, she holds their laughter, gentle currents, a cosmos of everything. What children say: I can't reach my cup, my water bottle. the snack up on the shelf. I can't do it. I won't do it. I would never do it in a million years. You need to help me. Help me faster. Do it the way I asked you to. I don't like pizza or watermelon. I don't like anything I liked before. I do not want it. I do not need it. I will never move up off this floor. Do not help me. Do not hold me. Do not sit down beside my bed. I'm not sleeping. I'm not tired. I'm too scared to fall asleep. You must hold me. You must rock me. Do not leave me all alone. I am thirsty. I am hungry. I am too tired to put my toys away. Do not be angry. Do not start singing. Where is the butterfly I drew? I'm still hungry. I'm still playing. Will you leave me? Will you stay? What mothers say? I am tired. I am sleeping. I am heading up to bed. Is it Tuesday? What's tomorrow? When's the last I slept alone? I am thinking. I am talking. Do you see I'm on the phone? Bring the dishes, find your blanket, put that book back on the shelf. It is bedtime. It is rest time. You need to go and brush again. I am working. I am eating. This is why we bought you toys. Go and play now. Find your brother. Find elsewhere to make your ship. I am angry. You're not listening. Please stop crying on the floor. It's a school night. Do your homework. Let me come and scratch your back. I am listening. I can hear you. Thanks for telling me the truth. Let me closer. Let me help you. I am here now. Let me stay. For my daughter on a bad day. Life will rough you up, throw you to the shore like a wave crashing, sand in your hair, blood in your teeth. When grief sits with you, hand dipped with rage, let it linger. Hold its pulse in your hands. There is no remedy for a bad haircut or ruined love like time. Even when death is coming, even when the filth rises in the back of your throat, this is not the worst of it. And if it is, listen for the catbird calling. No matter the wreckage, they still sing for you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Kate. The rising demand for long-term care requires a particular type of support and training for families and caregivers. In our next panel, we'll hear what can be done to better support those needing care and those providing it. Former First Lady Rosalind Carter has worked for more than 5 decades to improve the quality of life for people around the world. She's a leading advocate for mental health, caregiving, early childhood immunization, human rights, and conflict resolution through her work at the Carter Center, which was founded by Mrs. Carter and former President Jimmy Carter in 1982. Maria Shriver is founder of the Women's Alzheimer's Movement. She's an Emmy and Peabody Award-winning journalist and a 7-time New York Times bestselling author. In 2010, she broke ground by reporting for the first time that women, and in particular women of color, are at an increased risk for Alzheimer's. Ai-jen Poo is the Executive Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and the Director of Caring Across Generations. Ai-jen is a nationally recognized expert on elder and family care, the future of work, and what's at stake for women of color. She's the author of The Age of Dignity, Preparing for the Elder Boom in a Changing America. I'm honored to welcome Mrs. Carter to share some introductory remarks. Then the 19th's editor-at-large, Erin Haynes, will lead a conversation with Maria Shriver and Ai-jen Poo.
Good afternoon. I am pleased that the 19th is calling attention to the caregiving crisis in our country. Thank you to everyone participating today for your efforts to support the 53 million Americans who are putting their own well-being on hold, often at great personal cost and sacrifice, to provide care to a family member or friend. While they are the backbone of our national health care system, they are often overlooked and alone, and they desperately need our help. I know firsthand the struggles that caregivers face. When I was in my early teens, my father and grandmother died, leaving my mother, an only child, to care for her 4 children and her elderly father. For the next 25 years, my mother hardly rested. She raised us, worked multiple jobs to support us, and tended to Papa until his death. Her experience inspired me to establish the Rosalind Carter Institute for Caregivers, and the Institute's work is timelier now than ever. For more than 3 decades, the Rosalind Carter Institute has offered programs to train caregivers to meet their demanding responsibilities and advocated for policies favorable to them. More than 10 years ago, we issued a call to action report, Averting the Caregiving Crisis, Why We Must Act Now. Yet, sadly, the scale of the crisis is even larger today. Our nation must recognize the tremendous contributions of caregivers, especially important during the past year, and they must develop an effective public health strategy to support them. To further this discussion, I am pleased to introduce 2 women I admire, Maria Shriver and Ajin Poo. I am deeply grateful to both for their strong commitment to caregiving. I know this will be a wonderful, energizing conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Carter, for those powerful words and for your ongoing commitment to caregiving and mental health for women everywhere. Now I want to welcome Maria and Ajin, who I have been looking very forward to speaking to this month, as I have watched the issue of caregiving in the pandemic, and now as a matter of policy, with our lawmakers literally considering the future of caregiving even as we speak. So let's just get right to it. Maria, thank you so much for being here. I want to start with you because a decade ago, you published a groundbreaking report that really sounded the alarm on the reality that Alzheimer's discriminates against women and women of color. I want to ask you, where's the fight today?
Well, the fight is further along, but it's clearly not where we had hoped it would be. We had hoped that we would know why it discriminates against women, and particularly women of color. We don't know the answer to that issue at this moment, but we are researching in a myriad of different ways than we were 10 years ago. We do take that as fact that it now discriminates against women. So you hear researchers and doctors and everybody in this field focusing on that. We also, in that report, shone a spotlight on the fact that 2/3 of all the caregivers in this country were also women, and that caregiving disproportionately impacted women of color. So I think that report was groundbreaking on several fronts. It changed the narrative of Alzheimer's. It changed the narrative of caregiving. It put both front and center, and it put a spotlight on both of these issues. And it also said to researchers, you've got to look beyond plaques and tangles. You've got to look beyond tau. That's fine to look there, but let's also look at how women's brains age differently than men. Let's look at estrogen. Let's look at women in midlife. Let's look at perimenopause and menopause. Let's look where we haven't looked before. And certainly it's my hope that we will one day find a cure, or we'll find some kind of cocktail of cure. But we have more people getting Alzheimer's today than ever before. And the crisis of Alzheimer's, the crisis of aging, and the crisis of caregiving are at a critical juncture in our country today.
Yeah, you raised such a good point, and this is a good time to bring you into Ajin, because I think we also need to be having a broader conversation, to your point, around attitudes around aging and the intersection of aging and gender and what that means for this conversation. And so I guess, Ajin, from your perspective, where do you see really our approach to the idea of aging as a country? Especially around aging and gender, and what that means for mental health and healthcare and caregiving more broadly.
Well, thanks for the question, and it's great to be with you, Erin, and always to my Shiro, Maria, who I've learned so much from over the years. The way I think about this is the fact that in our country, every single day, 10,000 people turn 65. And that's going to continue. Every 8 seconds, we have somebody who reaches retirement age. And because of advances in healthcare and technology, people are living longer than ever before. So we have more people who are older in this country than we ever have or ever could have imagined that we would have. And we don't have the culture, the policy, the infrastructure in place to support quality of life and caregiving for this entire generation that we've added onto our lifespan. And in fact, we, instead of leaning into the fact that we're aging and living longer, we avoid the conversation and the question and the preparation that's required in order to establish the policies and infrastructure we need to live well as we age. And our failure to do that, to have a conversation about aging and what it means to live well as we age, and what policies we need in place, what infrastructure for caregiving we need in place. Our failure to have that conversation means that we have a broken, at best, system and infrastructure, and women are bearing the brunt and paying the price for that on every level. Women who on average live longer and will need care longer, women who are disproportionately our caregivers in our families, women who, especially women of color, who are the workforce that we rely on to take care of us as home care workers, home health aides, personal care aides. And every dimension of this challenge, women are bearing the brunt and paying the price for our failure to build the kind of infrastructure and systems and culture we need to support healthy aging. And we have the opportunity to change all of that right now. We have a whole new conversation, including this one, about caregiving in this country. And I think that this is our moment. I mean, Maria's been talking about these issues for years. We have partnered for years on these issues, and we finally have the country's attention, and it gives me so much hope.
I think what Ajin's saying is so true, because I think, as I always say, women are at the epicenter of the Alzheimer's epidemic, and they will be the ones to find a solution. The same goes for caregiving. These jobs disproportionately, as Ajin said, fall on the shoulders of women. They have to leave the workforce. They lose out on their prime earning years. They lose out on Social Security benefits. They are the ones that adjust to take care of aging parents, always at the same time as they are trying to raise young children and be primary breadwinners. And they are the ones, I think they're going to have to force this conversation and keep this conversation in the mainstream. What do we want to pay those who care for us as we age? Is that a minimum wage job? Is that a job without benefits? Do we want to pay our trainer at the gym triple what we pay someone who cares for our parents as we age? These are, I think, moral conversations. These are value conversations. These are big conversations that we have to have as a country. How do we want to age? And I think COVID has, we saw so many deaths in nursing homes and among caregivers in nursing homes, and people are going, wait a minute. Maybe I don't want to be in a nursing home. Maybe I don't want to send my loved one to a nursing home. But what is the cost of keeping someone at home? Who's going to do that? Who's going to pay for that? We haven't had that larger conversation. I think that's what Ajin has been talking about, to try to kind of unpack what it costs to age and who's going to pay for it. Over and over, when I travel around, certainly my state here in California, people are flabbergasted, stunned that they have to go into bankruptcy to get help. They're stunned that what falls on their doorstep to pay for. They had this conception and have a conception that the government is going to be there to help them. And they don't realize how much falls on them to help themselves and their families. And this is something I think that has to come out of the shadows onto the front doorstep of every home and into the halls of Congress.
Well, Maria, you raised such a good point there. You and Ajin have been aware of and working on these issues for such a long time, but the pandemic has really forced this conversation for the rest of the country because the coronavirus crisis exacerbated pre-existing inequality across our society. The women that have been impacted by and responding to caregiving and are feeling this at both ends really are such a huge part of that. So talk a little bit, Ajin, about the impact of the last year for women in terms of caregiving, particularly minority women, both in terms of the women who are battling various illnesses as they age, but also the women who are taking care of them.
Well, I think before the pandemic, most of us thought about caregiving as a personal burden or responsibility, and one that women just kind of had to figure out on our own behind the closed doors of our households all over the country. And I think what the pandemic did, as we were all isolated, schools closed, daycares closed, parents getting evacuated from nursing homes or isolated thousands of miles away from us, I think we all realized that this crisis was not a personal failure, that it is impossible to manage care in isolation, and it's not our fault, that we actually need systems and infrastructure and programs that can help us and support us take care of the most important aspects of our lives, especially as we work. So we had this awakening, and it's been driven by, frankly, a lot of rage that parents are feeling right now, moms in particular, at having to have just a series of impossible choices about working while their kids are home from school, struggling with online learning in this new environment with fear around safety and health. And I know so many essential care workers who've been on the front lines through the pandemic, Black and brown women who have every single day ventured out of their homes because they know they're an essential lifeline to some of the people who are most vulnerable to the virus itself, older people, people with disabilities. They've been delivering food, medication, in some cases, the only personal human contact that people have. And they've been doing that early on in the pandemic with no PPE, no health care, no job security, and an average annual income of $17,000 per year, while their own kids were home from school and in need of care too. It's just been a series of impossible choices, and it has pushed millions of women out of the workforce just based off of the challenge of having to navigate this new caregiving reality in the pandemic and work at the same time. And I think for women of color, those choices have just been compounded in terms of the challenges. And for essential workers like care workers who also have families that they care for, just all kinds of fear and vulnerability, and also strength to survive it all. And I think what we want to do is double down on their strength and invest in these workers, invest in our ability to care for each other, support our caregivers. Now that we've learned and seen how essential caregiving is, how do we make sure that as we build back from this pandemic crisis, that we're putting the needs of caregivers and every one of us who relies on good caregiving front and center?
I think also, and what's unique at this moment and kind of works on the work that IGEN and so many others have done is that we now have a president who is talking about these issues. We now have here in California a governor who is talking about an aging state and what needs to be put in place for the millions of people who are going to age forward. I think when political leaders take on this issue, take on these kinds of issues, not as women's issues, but really as issues for our country, situate them kind of smack dab in the conversation about who we are as a country, what we need in our infrastructure as a country, what we pay people to care for one another. The issue takes on a different weight, a different gravitas. And I think it's important for a president to single this issue out. It's important, it's imperative for a president or a governor to talk about an aging country and who is going to care for us, and to take care out of the women's issue corner and put it front and center. Because if you're lucky enough to age, it doesn't, matter who you are, what party you are, what gender you are. Aging is a gift, and people want to age well. They want to age at home. They want to age independently. But how do we do that? So it's a kind of a great kind of crossroads of healthcare and care and aging. And I think the pandemic also brought young people to the attention of like, wow, my parents are in a vulnerable age group. Who is going to care for my parents? Maybe many of them moved in to care for their parents or work with their parents. So I think we're in a different time than we were a year ago, 5 years ago. And that's why the work that IGEN and so many others are doing is so important at this moment in time, because it's great that we're having this conversation now, but this conversation has to be, bigger than this. It has to include all of us, right? And it's not a women's issue, although I think it will be women who keep it front and center.
Yeah. And you know, to your point about you know, the political leadership and the role that you know, a president can play in really making this a priority for the country and for our government. Your thoughts on President Biden really talking about caregiving as 21st century infrastructure, and Ajin, I just hope that you could kind of chime in and add your thoughts on, you know, how involved you have felt that the administration has been in these early days around the issue of caregiving and pushing this, you know, at a policy level as something that the government should address. And for people who don't understand why that matters, why this is an issue for the government to take on. But Maria, I'll come to you first on the issue of infrastructure, caregiving as infrastructure.
Well, I think, you know, I've seen it on the state level for the last year and a half. I chaired a task force here for Governor Newsom, as I said, on Alzheimer's. It was part of the master plan on aging. He put together multiple task force and a large kind of council to give him recommendations for how California should address its aging population. California is an aging state. We have more people with Alzheimer's than any other state. We have more caregivers than any other state. And we gave him 10 recommendations. He's allocated about $32 million in this budget alone to deal with. We wanted him to put a senior advisor on aging and Alzheimer's. We wanted him to develop standards of care, a public awareness campaign. We wanted to kind of develop healthy aging cities around our state. We wanted to look at geriatric workforce development. We wanted to do caregiving training. And this is the kind of thing I think Ajin can talk to on a national level that the president is also advocating for. We have to get, in order for people to go into caregiving, you have to pay them a living wage, right? They have to see it as a profession, as something where they can advance in. We have, you know, we don't have enough geriatric doctors. We don't have enough social workers. We don't have enough caregivers. So we looked at all different ways of trying to get young people, much like they did in Teach for America or the Peace Corps, to go into caregiving, trying to pull in all different populations to look at this as a statewide crisis. And I think that's what the president is doing on the national level, and certainly what Ajin is doing in terms of trying to pass a bill to bring this front and center.
I mean, I think if the definition of infrastructure is the programs, policies, and personnel that enable economic activity and society to function, what could be more fundamental as infrastructure than care? The child care, the paid family leave, the home care, the long-term care that we need to make sure that our families are safe and well as we work and participate in the economy. And what the president has done in his American Jobs Plan is really articulate how investing in care, access to care for working families, and the caregiving workforce, investing in that as infrastructure is just as important as the roads and bridges and tunnels, the broadband, the infrastructure that we need that is more traditionally understood as infrastructure. And I'll say that he has included a proposal to put $400 billion into home and community-based care for the aging population and for people with disabilities, with two goals. The first is to expand access to those services through Medicaid, so more people who need them can get them, and to raise wages and improve the benefits for this workforce so we can sustain the people who are charged with caring for us as a profession. And that investment is good for jobs and the economy in so many ways. One, the direct benefit to home care jobs that are mostly held by women and women of color, making those jobs that can't be outsourced and won't be automated really good jobs is critical and will benefit us and the economy. The second is the benefit to working family caregivers who need care and services in order to go to work. If you have a job, but you have to spend more than 20 hours a week caring for an aging loved one or a loved one with disabilities, whether or not you have supportive services and access to a home care provider could make the difference between your ability to actually have the agency to go to work or not. And then finally, for quality of life for the growing aging population and people with disabilities who want to age at home, connected to us, communities and families and the lives that they know. It's about their quality of life. It's about their dignity. And overwhelmingly, right, it's women who are living longer and will rely on those services. So at every dimension, this is a jobs and infrastructure question, and it is an equity question. It's about women being able to work, women of color having good jobs, and all of our families having the care that we need.
I think it's also really important, as Ajin said in the beginning, 10,000 baby boomers are turning 65 every single day. More than half of them will need some kind of care as they grow older. Who will care for them? Many of them don't have children, don't have families. I think this is the kind of overall big umbrella, big $1 million question is who is going to care for us as we grow older? And I think that's about putting the infrastructure in today so that people don't have to make the choice between being able to get some care and put food on the table. You know, the goal of this country should be that people can age forward, can age independently as best they can, that they don't have to choose between care and medicine, right, and food. That's kind of a question of who we are as a country. What is our character? What do we care about? What's important to us? The roads we drive on certainly need infrastructure, but the people who care for us are just as important. They both are kind of the foundation of who we are as a country.
Yeah. I'm wondering if both of you could also just talk about how access to care really varies for women, depending on where they live, things like their financial status, their marital status even, and does compensation for care also vary depending on geography or other factors?
Well, I think we live in a country where that is the fact when it comes to healthcare in general, right? We've seen, I think COVID has kind of shown a light once again on the disproportionate care that you get depending on where you live, depending on the color of your skin, depending on pre-existing conditions. We know a lot about Alzheimer's now and pre-existing conditions. We know, going back, Erin, to what you were asking me, what do we know now about Alzheimer's and aging that we didn't know maybe 10 years ago? We're now getting a lot of people to say, wait a second, lifestyle has a lot to do with how we age. So the younger we can get people to focus on living a healthy lifestyle, looking at pre-existing conditions, looking at their family's history, the better chance they have to age well, to age independently, to age in a healthy manner. But also, you know, people get their healthcare through their job. So as people get older, they lose their job, right? They lose their healthcare, and they are stunned, as I said, wherever I go, at how little they get from the government and how it doesn't even begin to cover what they need as they get older. And for so many women, they end up using the family finances for a husband who gets sick before they get sick. And when it's their turn, there's nothing left for them.
And the other piece of this, Erin, is that women are 2/3 of all minimum wage workers. And came into, well, at least pre-pandemic, and millions of women have been pushed out of the workforce since then, especially women of color. But the reality is that when you have so many people living in working poverty or on the brink of poverty while they're working, how are they going to afford childcare at an average cost of $9,000 a year? The average cost of a room in a nursing home is more than $100,000 per year. And 60% of our workforce earns less than $50,000 a year. So the care that we need is actually really out of reach. We are paying for care in incredibly costly and inefficient ways. And the cost is borne the greatest and the hardest by women and women of color. And that is why investing in our caregiving programs and making home care, making childcare, making paid leave accessible to all is really essential for there to be equity in our economic recovery and in our economy for the 21st century. And so it's all kind of connected, right? We need jobs that pay a living wage. We need infrastructure to support our ability to care for our families while we're working. And we need the kind of economic security and mobility, the safety net that's going to be able to actually keep us safe.
And we need respect and dignity for those jobs, right? We need to honor the people that are doing those jobs so that they feel good about being in those professions, and that we pay them a living wage so that they feel good, that they feel like this is a job that they can stay in. So many of the people that are in these professions are really, saints in progress. I mean, it is hard 24-hour-a-day work. And also to educate caregivers moving forward, because how you care for somebody with Alzheimer's is very different than how you care for somebody with Parkinson's, and how you care for somebody with special needs who might also then have Alzheimer's. So educating our caregiving force about all of these different diseases and how they impact people cognitively, mentally, physically. We need different kinds of caregivers for different kinds of diseases as people age forward.
Yeah, I mean, the point that you're making about the reality that this is a skill and an expertise that has value.
Absolutely. I had two parents aging at the same time. My mother was having strokes and broken hips and strokes, and she needed a very different caregiver than my dad, who had Alzheimer's. He needed a man. He needed somebody who could, carry him or help him. And, he had a completely different set of needs than she did. And it was really hard to find people who understood what Alzheimer's was and wasn't, how it changed, how it evolved, who understood sundowning and who understood all the different aspects of it, versus somebody who had a stroke. That was a completely different thing versus, so many people with special needs. We have a whole special needs disabled population who is aging forward, and their parents are dying off. Who's going to care for them? And many of them with Down syndrome end up getting Alzheimer's. What are the needs of someone to care for them?
Yeah. And I think that there are so many people in this country who, especially in the past year, have learned a lot of those lessons that you described, dealing with your own parents. We've got just a few minutes left, so I want to just circle back and ask both of you. I mean, you talked about the government, having a role really in addressing the caregiving crisis, and the president being responsive to that. But I wonder how hopeful both of you are. I mean, the American Jobs Plan, which has caregiving as infrastructure, is being taken up in Congress right now. How encouraged are you that this is something that is going to become law, like the American Rescue Plan did, and that caregiving is going to be something that our government will be addressing going forward to help all of us get to a new normal? Ajin, I'll start with you.
Well, I am certainly inspired and determined, and I think we have more momentum than we've ever had on caregiving issues and supporting caregivers, more awareness about the importance and urgency of investing in our caregiving systems and our caregivers, and more champions than ever before. And we're having conversations like this one, which is just really exciting. And everyone is touched by this issue. There isn't a single voter in this country who isn't touched by the need for caregiving in America. And so I'm very hopeful, and I'm doing the work because sometimes hope isn't enough. You need power and organizing. So we got to do the work. And for all of you who are watching and care about these issues, your members of Congress need to hear from you now. Call them, make an appointment, share your care story, talk about how important home care, child care, paid leave, these programs, talk about how they are essential infrastructure that need investment for our economic recovery.
I would agree with Ijen. I'm super inspired about this moment in our history. Like Ijen, I've been around a while. I remember when I had my first child 31 years ago, there was no maternity leave. Nobody even took it. At network news, nobody talked about, child care hardly at all. When my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, nobody talked about Alzheimer's, much less caregiving. Now people are talking about it. You have women running companies, and they know what it's like to try to balance childcare and elder care. We still can have a much more open conversation at the corporate levels. I read a poll recently that said the vast majority of people who are trying to balance care at both ends of the spectrum said their bosses had no idea about what they were dealing with. So I think our own personal stories put out onto Main Street are really helpful. So if you are balancing these issues, talk to your boss about them. Tell them what you're dealing with. Share it with your neighbors. As Ijen said, share it with your congresspeople. Share it with your local representative. Share it with your senators, your congressmen, your governors. It's wonderful that the president is focusing on this. Make sure he puts it in the State of the Union. Make sure every governor puts it in their State of the State, and so on. Make sure that we start to build cities that are different in the future than they are today. And then talk about health, starting at a very young age. Prevention, prevention, prevention. Talk about really kind of how we honor people in these jobs and how we pay them, how we look at them, how we speak about them. This is a big 360-degree conversation, and it's in a better place today than it's been certainly since I've been working in this space, and that's a great thing, but it's definitely not where it needs to be, and it definitely can't take your foot off the accelerator.
Yeah. Well, we certainly appreciate everyone who has shared their stories with us at the 19th to help us keep this issue front and center, as we will continue to do, because we know, the urgency of the caregiving crisis and the need to really get to a new normal for this entire country. So thank you both so much for this essential conversation. It's a tall order for our society to grapple with, but it is clear that there is a role for all of us to play. So we'll stay tuned for if and how that happens, and how this country intervenes to help us all get to that new normal. Thank you both so much. Take care.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks to the 19th.
Yes, thank you, 19th.
Thank you, Maria and Ijen, for that informative and timely discussion with Erin. Now for our keynote conversation. Senator Susan Collins of Maine is the first ever Republican woman to win a 5th term. She serves as a senior member of the Appropriations Committee and previously chaired the Special Committee on Aging. Senator Amy Klobuchar, a Democrat, is the first woman elected to represent the state of Minnesota in the U.S. Senate and has introduced repeat legislation to help support seniors during the coronavirus pandemic. This spring, Senators Klobuchar and Collins together reintroduced the Alzheimer's Caregiver Support Act to expand training and support services for those caring for patients with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. The 19th's Washington correspondent Amanda Becker will lead this conversation.
Thank you, Emily. The 19th is thrilled to have Senators Collins and Klobuchar here with us today to discuss elder care. It is an issue they've worked on together and separately over their years in Congress. For example, Senator Klobuchar introduced 2 bills earlier this year that Senator Collins has co-sponsored. They were the Alzheimer's Caregiver Support Act and the Safe and Affordable Drugs from Canada Act. They have also co-written a bill that would prevent elder fraud. Before we get into the specifics, though, I thought it would be good context for us all to hear from each senator about what they've heard from the elderly populations in their own states, about what the needs are generally and specifically as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. And we'll start with you, Senator Collins, because Maine actually has the oldest average age of any state in the country. What have you been hearing from your constituents there, both generally and as we kind of deal with the tail end of this COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, you're absolutely right, Amanda, and thank you for hosting this event, that Maine has the oldest population by median age in the country. And what I have heard during the past year and a half is the impact of isolation on our seniors. Many of our seniors, because of COVID, have been cut off from regular contact with their grandchildren, with their children, their neighbors, their social circle. Congregate meal settings have closed, for example. And I think there's a lot of loneliness out there. And loneliness is not just a problem emotionally. Our aging committee hearings have shown that it can lead to adverse physical health consequences. In fact, prolonged isolation and loneliness is the equivalent, according to one expert, to smoking 15 cigarettes a day as far as its impact on your physical health. So that's probably the number one issue that I hear about. Second would be financial security in retirement. People worried about outliving their savings, about the health of the Social Security Trust Fund, whether it will still pay their benefits. So those are the two top issues that I hear the most about.
And Senator Klobuchar, are you hearing the same sorts of things in Minnesota from your constituents? And how has the COVID-19 pandemic complicated elder care and taking care of elders there?
Well, I am hearing the same things. And I think before the pandemic, we knew there were issues that Susan and I actually have worked on together. I have so much respect for her, and we're good friends, and we both see some of the same stuff and we act on it. I remember a few years ago, we both heard about the drug shortage issue for certain kinds of drugs, and we led a bill that actually passed. And now what I'm hearing from our seniors is just a magnified version of what we've been hearing for a while. The financial issues that Susan raised with their, yes, Social Security, making sure that stays in place, but also the affordability of prescription drugs. The other thing that has dominated this pandemic is, of course, that loneliness and the idea that you don't know when you're even going to be able to hold someone's hand again or give them a hug. I had this same experience with my own dad, who we just lost the last few weeks. He was 93 and led an incredible life as a newspaper columnist. But in the middle of last year, he got COVID. And I still remember standing outside of his assisted living. He had Alzheimer's, and standing out there, and he looked so small in this room, and they're holding this phone up to him so he could talk to us. He can't figure out why we're wearing masks, why we're outside, and you just want to give him a hug and you can't. He ended up surviving COVID, but he later died of other causes. But he was that experience, and seeing some of the other people in the assisted living who would try to FaceTime, but it was really hard for them to do, just brought home for me how difficult this time is. And so what I'm hoping is we take this horror of this pandemic and learn, of course, how to handle pandemics in the future differently. They're always going to be different, but also learn about things like remote visitation and how we can have good equipment at these places so that you can have visitors, whether there's a pandemic or not. And how we're handling all of really aging. To me, it's been the elephant in the room. We want to keep people at home as much as possible, but we also know that there are some moments where people need to go to assisted care. And so leaving those options for our seniors, I think, has become really clear through this pandemic.
And we were very sorry to hear about your father, Senator Klobuchar, and I would like to circle back a little bit later to your experiences with the disease of Alzheimer's specifically, because you've both worked on legislation related to that. But in the COVID-19 relief package, there were some provisions related to seniors. There was some extra Medicaid funding to keep seniors in their homes and in community programs, so they didn't have to enter the sort of facilities where they might be more susceptible to the spread of a pandemic like this. There was also some funds for the deployment of what was called strike teams to help in nursing homes when there are outbreaks. Do we learn anything from kind of these provisions in the COVID bill that we might be able to apply more broadly or to keep around even as we're emerging from this pandemic?
Absolutely. I think the biggest lesson is how effective and important telemedicine can be. Under the CARES Act, which was passed in March of last year, we, for the first time, authorized far broader Medicare reimbursements for telemedicine. Well, Amy and I both represent states where there are very large rural areas where there is a shortage of healthcare professionals. And what we found with telemedicine is that people are comfortable using it, particularly if they need help with an emotional problem or crisis that they're facing, or with substance abuse and addiction being so rampant and going up during this pandemic. But I think that is a lesson from the pandemic, that we should make the reimbursements for telemedicine permanent so that they can be used whether or not we have a pandemic. In addition, we've learned that we've got to have better access to broadband in underserved and unserved areas. I have parts of rural Maine where internet service is either prohibitively expensive, such as $15,000 to get it to your doorstep, or it's simply not available at all. And that's why all of the COVID bills have had funding, or virtually all the major ones have had funding for broadband expansion. And I expect that to be a consensus area for the infrastructure bill as well.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I was just over at the White House with a group of senators, Democrats and Republicans, talking about the broadband infrastructure. And that's one of the bills that I lead in the Senate. And we are very close. In fact, the White House had talked about supporting a number that had been put forward in the Republican proposal when it came to broadband. Not on everything, but on that, which is something like $65 billion for the country. That would make that amount of money, we had a little more, would be so helpful for getting broadband to every corner. Because remember, it's not just the assisted livings themselves. If someone is in assisted living, it's where their loved ones are so they can communicate. Or more likely, you have seniors at home, and we do want people to stay at home as much as possible. That's why we've worked so hard on caregiver issues and the like. Well, they need good enough broadband, the seniors do, so they can communicate. And it's not just an email anymore. People want to see each other by video and by Zoom. One of my favorite memories of the last year was when my mother-in-law realized that there was a gallery view after an hour-and-a-half Thanksgiving Zoom call. And she had thought she could only see one person at a time. And then right when we were ending, she saw the gallery view and decided we should stay on for another hour so she could see everyone at the same time. But the point is that they should have those options, and it made a big difference in a lot of people's lives when they were able to use that service and that they had access to the service. It's really both things.
You mentioned you were just at the White House as part of these bipartisan negotiations on infrastructure. It's not clear yet whether the Biden administration is going to try and move infrastructure at the same time as its jobs plan, separately or together. We're still waiting to figure that out. In the jobs plan put forth by President Biden, there are caregiving provisions, including related to elder care. He proposes allocating about $400 billion over 8 years, for example, to support home and community-based care, the kind that was encouraged in some of the COVID relief. Setting aside process and the overall price tag of the other things that go into that caregiving package, are there things in this caregiving package coming from the White House that you think have broad support that we might be able to work on in some way in terms of getting it across the finish line? What do you think does and doesn't work from a policy standpoint on those elder care provisions?
Well, I think, first of all, the investments in home or community-based care are very popular. People understand the needs in their own states, in their own neighborhoods, friends, family. And that's why I think you see emphasis on that. We also know that increasing pay and benefits for care workers can lead to an increase in the quality of care, and that's according to research by Leading Age. And that's why it's critical that we take this opportunity to invest in that infrastructure. I think, negotiations are still going on. Susan's always in the middle of every negotiation in terms of trying to find bipartisan support. But I think it's really important that we learn the lessons from this pandemic and make sure that seniors who want to stay in their homes do, that we make sure that caregivers are able to either, if they have jobs themselves, they're able to balance that, or they're able to keep going with their economically while being a caregiver. And so that's a lot of the focus here, is the investments in home and community-based care.
What about you, Senator Collins? Do you see some consensus points potentially on elder care specifically in what has been proposed?
I do. Obviously, I don't think it belongs in an infrastructure bill, but I have been a strong proponent and a leader on home health care issues since my very first year in the Senate, when I went on a home health care visit in my home county of Aroostook in northern Maine, and visited a couple who were both getting home health care, and it was allowing them to stay together in their own home. And that's what they wanted more than anything. They didn't want to be separated. They didn't want to go to a long-term care facility. They didn't want to be hospitalized. They wanted to stay together, and home health care made that possible. There have been a number of problems with reimbursement on home health care over the years. For example, if you're providing home health care in the heart of New York City, you're not traveling far between patients in many cases. If you're in rural Maine, you may be traveling a great distance between patients. So for years, we had what we called a rural add-on. It was an increased reimbursement for home health care delivered in rural areas, and that needs to be revived and extended. We're finding that home health care in some cases, and hospice care, can be delivered by telemedicine, where you can check vital signs and interview the patient. That's been really helpful in delivering home health care to the islands of the coast of Maine. But there again, broadband has been a problem. The reception is poor frequently. But home health care is also less expensive in many cases than, in virtually all cases, than long-term institutional care or repeated hospitalizations that home health care often can prevent. But most of all, it allows patients to be where they want to be, in the privacy, comfort, and security of their own homes. Finally, let me say that a related issue to that is providing respite care for caregivers. Both Amy and I have had the painful experience of losing a father to Alzheimer's disease. And I know how hard it was for my mother, who was heroic in taking care of my father at home for some 8 years. Only in the last year of his life did he go into the local veterans home for care. And I remember calling all around to try to find respite care so that she could get a break from the 24/7 job of taking care of my dad. Fortunately, my brothers and their families were in the same community and could help out, but it was really difficult. So we need to look at that part of home care as well.
Thank you for setting up what I wanted to talk about next so perfectly, Senator. I wanted to talk about your Alzheimer's caregiver bill that you both have, and what that grew out of. What do you think it might take to get it done this Congress? Do you think that's a possibility? And kind of the provisions it does have to assist families like both of your families who have, had a relative to care for with disease, and kind of the stress that can put on a caregiver. And if you want to start, Senator Klobuchar.
Sure. Susan and I have worked on this for quite a while, way back to making sure that we considered Alzheimer's an urgent national priority and a resolution on that front. And I think we know why. It's the most expensive disease out there. It's the most difficult for families, as Susan just described, to deal with. And it's really a hard way and a very, very long goodbye to lose a family member with Alzheimer's. The numbers, and the numbers really are just one thing. It's the real people that that are doing this, some of whom are watching this now. But family members and friends provide an estimated 15.3 billion hours last year of help, valued at nearly 257 billion. In unpaid care to people living with Alzheimer's and related dementias. Those caregivers also report higher levels of stress and depression than those who are providing care to individuals without dementia. And so what the bill would do is expand training and support services for the more than 11.2 million caregivers of patients with Alzheimer's disease or related dementia. And the other thing that I think would be really good is to do, which we've done, I've proposed before in other ways, but a tax credit for caregivers and ways to compensate them for the care that they gave. But we've tried to put a big emphasis on the caregivers.
The caregivers really are the hidden heroes, and they are frequently overlooked. And we both know from personal experience just how difficult it is for caregivers. I told the story of my mother, but there are many more just like her who are just amazing at what they try to do, but it takes a real toll, as Amy has pointed out, on their physical health and emotional well-being. And that's why I push hard for respite care. And I was also successful. We both worked on the BOLD Act, which was to take more of a public health approach to Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. And what this bill would do is it creates centers of excellence to identify best practices, how to diagnose accurately and early for Alzheimer's disease, and help give advice and training to caregivers. So I'm pleased to say that that bill has become law and is now being implemented. And I think that that has the potential to be a breakthrough in the caregiving area and in our recognition that Alzheimer's truly is a public health issue that we need to confront. That's also why we've worked so hard to increase funding for Alzheimer's research to a record high last year.
I know that you're both squeezing this in between votes today, so I'll try and get one more question to you both, and then we'll wrap this up. You also have a bill that would crack down on fraud against seniors, people who are taking advantage of seniors. What did you discover was kind of the problem in this area? How would the bill address it? What's the likelihood of getting this done? And along with the last one, do you see these two things, the Alzheimer's bill and the fraud prevention bill, as things that might have enough support to become law in the next year or two?
Yes, I'll go for my prosecutor background here. I have long been focused on the senior fraud issue, and I'm really pleased to do this bill with Susan. I remember when I had my old job as a prosecutor, back then it was simpler. You know, we'd find the evidence would be a guy who was going to burglar and go and break into senior housing. And he had in his car the old yellow pages, we remember those, and he had circled all the senior housing, and it was kind of good evidence for us to use. That's what he was doing. Well, now it's a lot more high tech, and you've got so many seniors, rightfully, and I'm so glad that they are using the internet, but they can be victims of fraud. And there's crazy stories of people getting victimized by emails to them, and then they give them a little information, then the people call them, and they basically take their life savings. And so what our bill would do, the Seniors Fraud Prevention Act, which, by the way, has passed through Congress in the past in different times in different houses, and so I do feel good about its chances. But that is to put funding into educating seniors about fraud schemes, improving the monitoring, responding better to the complaints from the agencies, the kind of seeing what these schemes are across the country and sharing that information, because our laws should be as sophisticated as the people who are trying to rip off our seniors.
And I'm delighted to be Amy's chief co-sponsor on this bill. When I was chair of the Senate Aging Committee, we held 25 hearings to expose senior scams. And unfortunately, seniors who live alone tend to be particularly vulnerable to this kind of sophisticated fraud that often originates outside of the country. And that's why I pressed the Department of Justice at the federal level to have a senior fraud attorney in every US attorney office within the United States, so that there would be someone who would focus on this problem that the Government Accountability Office tells us rips off seniors to the tune of more than $3 billion a year. Now, that's probably the tip of the iceberg, because a lot of this fraud is not reported, because seniors are embarrassed when they find out that they've been ripped off. These criminals are ruthless. They will do everything from impersonating an IRS officer and spoofing the telephone number so that it looks like it comes from the IRS, and they'll threaten a senior and tell that senior that he or she owes unpaid taxes and they better be wired to them within 24 hours. Totally fraudulent schemes that have deprived a lot of seniors of their hard-earned money. Perhaps saddest are the romance scams. And we had a case in Maine of a pastor who was retired, who developed a relationship online with what he thought was a woman. In fact, it was most likely a male member of an international criminal cartel. And to make a long story short, this individual totally inadvertently transported what he thought were papers to Spain, when in fact it was cocaine. And he was caught, he was in prison. It took the work of our aging committee to get him out of prison in Spain. But these criminals will stop at nothing. And that's why the aging committee under my leadership when I was chair, every year put out a fraud book that listed the 10 top frauds that were reported to our fraud hotline. We had 10,000 calls to the hotline over 6 years, and also gave tips to seniors on how they could avoid becoming a victim.
Do you also agree, given it's passed before, this seems like something that could potentially get done in the near future?
I absolutely do. And I'm working, we've had some success together in working to make it easier to trace robocalls that are coming from India, for example, and call centers there. And I am very hopeful that our bill can be enacted this year. It's already passed the House, and I think we can get it signed into law, and that it will make a difference for seniors who are being ripped off by these ruthless, sophisticated criminals who keep devising new schemes and new scams targeting our seniors.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for joining us
Sure,
today.
I wanted to note that Susan Collins has the best voting record in the Senate, like consecutive votes. Like she's never missed a vote. I maybe missed a few when I ran for president, but we can't let her miss a vote.
Yes, we can't. So I give great thanks to you both for joining us today to talk about this important issue. And I hope you can get to the vote as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Senators Collins and Klobuchar, for this discussion and for your work to support seniors, their families, and caregivers. For our next keynote conversation, the 19th's healthcare reporter Shefali Luthra is in conversation with disability rights activist Judith Heumann. Judy is an internationally recognized leader in the disability rights community and a lifelong civil rights advocate. President Obama appointed her as the first special advisor for international disability rights at the U.S. Department of State. Her book, Being Human, an Unrepentant Memoir of a Disability Rights Activist, was released last year.
Thank you so much, Judy. It's great to speak with you. I was hoping we could begin this conversation by talking a bit about your experience and hearing how does personal assistance work in your life, and how do you find the people who work with you? How do you pay them? Just give us a bit of a sense for how this all works.
First of all, very nice to meet you, and I'm glad we're doing this interview. So I had polio in 1949. I'm what's called a quadriplegic, which means I don't walk, I don't stand. I have limited use of my hands and my arms. And so ever since I had polio, I've needed assistance with getting dressed, getting undressed, bathing, going to the bathroom, cooking, all those daily activities that most people are able to do by themselves. And my parents were the ones who primarily provided my personal assistance services when I was growing up. And then when I went to the university, Long Island University, I began to pay for people privately to help me with my personal assistance at university. That was in New York. And then I went to California. In California, they had a program called In-Home Supportive Services, which I was eligible for while I was in school because my income level was such that I was able to get onto that program. So then I was hiring people, the wage was being set by the state, and it was a consumer-directed program. So I was able to screen and hire the people that I wanted and did the paperwork, and then the state paid or the county paid. When I was moving forward and began to get jobs that were commensurate with my ability to work, then I fell off the cliff, meaning that I have had no financial support to pay personal assistance since about 1978. And this is an issue that we can get into discussing. And since then and through today, my personal assistance needs have expanded as I've gotten older and needed more assistance. And it's all private pay.
And so let's get into that question, because I think it's really important, right? Policy-wise, most people, right, it's Medicaid or it's private pay or other sorts of means-tested programs. What is needed to make personal assistance sustainable and affordable so that it can be accessed, and why is this so important?
Well, I think the Biden plan is really moving in an important new direction, because it's looking at the issue of salaries and benefits for workers, which is very important because these jobs are really critical to those of us who need the assistance. And for people who have children or family members that they are engaged with, it's also very important that overall we have confidence in the ability to recruit people and value the work that they're doing. What the program, the Biden plan, does not do is really address the issue of lack of uniformity of Medicaid, so that there are some states in the United States where they have something called Medicaid buy-in programs, and the amount of money that a person can be earning and still be able to get benefits varies. And so that's another very big issue. And again, the need to be able to see personal assistance as a right. I think that's really a critical issue that many people who are not engaged in this, either as a disabled person ourselves or family members who are providing supports, people don't really get that the ability to have quality, reliable people working the number of hours that we need to be able to live our lives like non-disabled people. So I think that's another really critical issue. And too frequently, those of us who need personal assistance are not really the center of discussions. There are exceptions to that rule, but I think it's fair to say that it needs to be more than an afterthought. It really needs to be something which is integral to any kind of discussions, programming that's going on, both for those of us who are direct users of personal assistance and for family members who are providing supports. I think people need to have a much clearer understanding of what we mean by reliable, what we mean by people who are qualified. So for me, it's very important that I'm able to train the people that are going to work for me. That general training is not going to be sufficient, only because I have certain ways that I do things, not that I have any high-level medical needs, which obviously some people do have. So I think really taking this discussion of what personal assistance services are, and you notice I haven't used the word care. I don't like to use the word care. I realize that that's something that many people don't necessarily agree with, but I think it's very important that we're looking at personal assistance being centered with those of us who are using. And I want people to see that they are assisting me or they are assisting whomever. And regardless of the significance of the person's disability, we really want to make sure that things are person-centered always.
Could you go a little in, because I think this is really important, the implications, right, of the Medicaid buy-in, sort of the income standards, right? So what happens if someone does make too much to qualify for personal assistance being paid through these programs?
Well, they lose their benefits. So, and it's not just the personal assistance. There are other benefits that they may be losing. And I think, as probably most people who are viewing this understand, is there are tremendous inconsistencies with Medicaid across the country. states get to set many of their own rules. So those are also issues. And you'll see that disabled individuals may move to different states to be able to try to get better support so that they can, in fact, get jobs. I mean, really, many of the people that we're talking about for personal assistance today are older people, and jobs may not be the central part of what they're looking at because they finished their work days. But for younger people, in fact, we want to make sure that they are able to look at education and employment as something in the same manner that non-disabled people are expected to do. And so I think there is this expectation or lack of expectation about disabled people being able to work, particularly those of us with more significant disabilities, because people don't really understand what a good system could look like. And we're not there yet as a country.
Thinking about, I know you mentioned the president's plan, right? And right, it's a step in the direction you said, right, to where we need to go. But one thing that I'm wondering is that $400 billion that he's talked about, is that enough to make assistance available and affordable for all who need it? What else do we need to be thinking about, whether from personal assistance being financed, whether from employers or any other sectors that you think need to be addressed?
So I actually don't want to get into whether or not 400 billion is enough, given the negotiations that continue to go on and how there is disagreement on the part of one party about the level of financing that the president believes needs to happen for infrastructure and other related issues. So I think the point for me is we need a broader discussion. More people need to understand what we are aiming towards and why we are looking in that direction. We have many laws on the books today, like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Section 504, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and other laws that really have been slowly removing barriers that have prevented disabled individuals from advancing. As those barriers are removed and people, in fact, are more qualified for jobs at various levels, we need to make sure that for those of us who need personal assistance, regardless of the amount that we need, that it's something that we can avail ourselves of. And that individuals who want to do personally directed services are able to do that. And that family members who wish to be providing personal assistance can be paid for their services so that they're not indentured servants, which is what I think has really happened for many years. There's some changes going on in that area, but there's still not a fundamental understanding of who we are, what we need, what the benefit is, both for us and society overall.
Thinking about, right, the notion of disabled people as full-fledged workers, right, in our economy, one thing that I know you've spoken a good bit about is, right, the role of employers in supporting their employees. And I'd love to hear a bit about what workplace support looks like right now and what kind of effort you think needs to be seen to make workplace support for disabled employees fully available.
Thank you. So if we look at something called Section 501, which addresses the federal government. So the federal government has an obligation to ensure that workers who need sign language interpreters, readers, personal assistants are able to get those supports on the job and for the job, not without an expenditure for the individual. There are some employers that are slowly moving in that direction, and that I think is something which we need to be doing more of. We've advanced as a society to understand the importance of things like childcare and daycare. We are not at that level yet with the issue of personal supports for individuals who have physical disabilities and other forms of disabilities that may need support. I really want to underscore the fact that, typically speaking, personal assistance service costs are very limited. Most people do not need significant support, but the support that they need to get when they need it. And when they need it on the job to get their coat on and off, assistance in eating, going to the bathroom, whatever it may be, carrying materials from one meeting to another, working on their computer, doing various things, that will enhance their ability to not only do their jobs, but most importantly, to be valued workers within the companies that they're working for. And I think this is an issue that, as I said, companies are really looking at more, as in fact, more disabled people are being hired, and in affinity groups that are being set up, these issues are being discussed. We're not yet where we need to be, but I think the federal government under 501 is really beginning to do more work in this regard. And so I'm hoping over the next couple of years that we will be able to see a more meaningful shift in support that disabled workers need in order to perform their jobs appropriately.
Would you want to see some kind of public policy, whether legislation or executive action somehow, that might provide that kind of carrot or stick for employers to make this more widespread?
Sure, I think we need to be continuing to evaluate our policies to look at what barriers currently exist and what could be changed. But I think fundamentally, when you look at the gridlock that continues right now, part of it really is that I believe many members really don't understand clearly enough about what it is we're talking about, and narrowly look at issues around financing. So the audience today is people who are much more engaged in this discussion than typically occur. And so I'm hoping that one of the aspects that comes out of these presentations today is the ability to look at what more we need to do to ensure that people more clearly understand the importance of personal assistance. I think we can look at COVID and what we have seen with COVID, the number of individuals living in restricted living environments, the risk of contracting illnesses and dying. And that's really because of a lack of personal assistance services that people can have readily available for them. Again, emphasizing with workers who are respected and appropriately paid. Those are all things that we need to really discuss more of. I think we need to be using the word disability more. When we look at what's happened over the last year and a half with COVID, we typically are not talking about disabled individuals. We talk about people in nursing homes. Well, no one is living in a nursing home unless they have a disability. And many, many, many of those individuals would be able to live in their own homes if they had appropriate supports, which include in many cases modifications to apartments or houses that when a person moved in or bought, we're not looking at the issue of accessibility, and policies and practices around the country have only really in the last number of years been looking at the importance of accessibility of housing. So I look at life like an onion. And when we look at the issue of personal assistance services and the ability of people to be able to live in the community, we need to look at personal assistance plus. Are people getting the durable medical equipment they need to be able to move more independently, on and on?
I know we're hitting close to our time limit, but I do want to throw in, since you mentioned the past year of coronavirus, other questions, right, about the way the pandemic highlighted whether and how public health overlooks people with disabilities. And I want to ask you about vaccines. What was it like to watch the rollout of vaccines and to know that people with disabilities weren't prioritized? And what do you think should have been done better in making that happen?
Well, let me first say that I think what we've experienced over the last year and a half really shows the weakness of our overall public health system, whether you have a disability or not. And I sincerely hope that that's something that really is going to be addressed. We're not only operating under 50 states, but then separate procedures that go on in counties, and it's a dysfunctional system. And I think that's really what we learned. And so if we don't really agree that we have to look more seriously at how to make changes within our public health system, the narrow discussion of whether or not disabled people should have been getting vaccinated more rapidly is really, it's obviously very relevant, but it begs the question. So in looking at what's happened, I think in some communities, the ability to get healthcare workers or health workers the vaccine was very important, that they were able to get it first, including people that were working in people's homes. So I wasn't eligible to get the first round of vaccines in DC because I was 73 and it was being rolled out for 75-year-old people. One of my colleagues, Anna, who's in her 20s and has been involved in local district politics, was not able to get the vaccine originally either. And so it was her advocacy and advocacy of others that really allowed the city to understand why disabled individuals needed to be elevated to get the vaccination. And so that did happen. So in fact, I think it is a public health question overall, because the decisions that were being made under difficult situations didn't really take into consideration vulnerable populations that were at greater risk. And in the case of people like Anna and myself, if I would have been that young, it was very important that we be able to get the vaccine, because we're not, she is not a typical 22-year-old individual, because she has other health issues. And there are many people like that. So reform the public health system, really be able to have a system in place. So when and if this happens again, we're not scrambling the way we've still been scrambling. And we really get a better understanding of the society overall that vaccinations should not be a political issue. It really needs to be a public health issue. And if the public health care system is improved and elevated, I think over time, people will get to understand that better.
Judy, I wish we could talk all day, but I think we are hitting our limit. So thank you so much for doing this. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you. It's great talking to you and meeting you. I hope to see you.
You too.
Thank you, everybody.
Next up, we have a conversation from our founding sponsor, AARP. Please welcome Robin Golden, the Associate Vice President of Social Work and Community Health at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, Steve Braun, the Vice President of Global Benefits for Facebook, and Nancy Lamond, Executive Vice President and Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer at AARP, which has long advocated on behalf of American family caregivers and hopes to build something bold and lasting as caregiving is normalized post-pandemic.
Thanks, Emily. Robin and Steve, thanks so much for being here today and sharing your insights on how employers can support working family caregivers. Pre-COVID, there were 48 million Americans caring for an aging parent, spouse, or other adult loved ones. 67% are women, almost half are under the age of 50, and 61% were in the paid workforce, either full or part-time. Then the pandemic hit. A Genworth study found that 1 in 3 Americans became caregivers practically overnight last spring, carving out time to care for children who couldn't go to school or daycare and older family members who needed extra help to stay safe. It can be a real challenge in the best of times to balance work and care responsibilities, and we certainly haven't been living in the best of times. And in fact, more than 2 million women left the workforce entirely between March 2020 and February of this year, in part because of increased caregiving demands. We know there are things that employers can do to make it easier for folks to take care of their loved ones and to do their jobs at the same time. A lot of organizations have made changes over the last year, offering more flexibility and benefits that we hope will continue. And others, like your organizations, have made supporting caregivers in the workplace a focus for a number of years. So we have a chance to talk to you. Steve, let's turn to you first with our first question. Burnout for employees in general is at an all-time high. Employee benefits and flexibility are a huge part of what current and potential employees evaluate as they consider staying in a job or looking for a new one. Steve, what's the biggest shift over this past year in how Facebook is approaching how to support family caregivers?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy, for the question, and thanks for having us here. So first of all, I think it's the recognition of what you described in all the situations related to the pandemic. Homes are now an office, they're a child care center, they're a school, perhaps a health center if we're caring for a family member. So all those dynamics changed in March of 19. They literally changed overnight. So it forced all of us to rethink, how are people going to balance all these priorities? And we've seen over the course of the year, burnout has been a major issue because of the balancing of these priorities and how we support. So our mindset was first to really understand employers are at an advantage. We have a captive audience. We have feedback sessions. We have groups where we can learn immediately what's happening. So again, our mindset was to understand what's happening and start to craft solutions immediately to address some of those issues in hopes of alleviating burnout to provide better balance. And some of the things that we did in many employers are create leave programs. We were one of the first organizations to have an extensive COVID family leave program specifically designed for those that their children could no longer attend school or daycare facilities that closed. And as the same goes for those that were caring for elders. We provided up to 10 weeks of paid leave so they can reorient, reorganize. And we think some of those things, those practices that we put in place were one of the tools to help with burnout. The other elements, and perhaps Robin will share some as well, is really designing work in different ways, knowing that there was very little separation at home in these new arrangements to provide greater flexibility, to have programs to encourage and reinforce different working arrangements. And we believe some of those are having an impact now, just providing greater flexibility and tools to support, to avoid some of those burnout issues.
Thanks, Steve. And now to turn to you, Robin. There's been a lot in the news about healthcare workers being at the breaking point after a very hard 14 months in the pandemic. And so I'm sure that healthcare professionals who are serving double duty as family caregivers are even more taxed, anxious, and scared. What are some of the supports to offer healthcare employees who are not only caring for their patients in their day jobs, but are also caring for someone who is ill at home?
Talk about a double, triple whammy. And as Steve said, I mean, people who are in the healthcare field, not all of them were able to work from home. Most of them are not. So some of us had the luxury of being able to pivot that way. Others had to go in while still caring for parents and children and balancing all that. We did things like provide for childcare. Actually, we grew that a bit. Our Family Medical Leave Act was expanded for sure, our work in that area. But most importantly, we tried to really lead with empathy and to try to get a sense of what each person needed, because you can't make a global situation from specific individual issues. So we looked at flex hours. One of the most critical things is you have that, you're a caregiver at work and a caregiver at home. How do you ever help someone set limits? How do you help them know if they're ready, willing, and able to take on all these things? And if they are, how do you support them? And we've done a lot of work with family caregivers, period, at Rush. And we really made sure all of that family caregiver support also went to our employees and they're utilizing along those service lines. You know, family caregivers sometimes are very anxious to come out about their family caregiving because they think that their bosses might look at them as they're not being as productive as they should be. And we really try very hard to encourage that very embracing, understanding culture that that's not the way we think, but we know people have reality and how do we help them balance all that?
Robin, I wanted to expand on that last point you made. We know that mental health struggles that family caregivers are facing are real and a long-term concern. What are employees most fearful of when asking for help? And how can employers better assess and support how their employees are actually doing?
Absolutely. Thanks, Nancy. I think what people are most anxious about is identifying themselves as somebody who might be struggling. We as a society are not there yet in the biggest sense of being comfortable asking for help, right? So, how do we get beyond that? How do we encourage people to say, I need assistance, and there's nothing wrong with the fact that I'm struggling with this situation. I might be having some depression related to it, anxiety, certainly guilt, all of those kinds of things. How do we allow those to be felt and hold those feelings in a non-stigmatizing way? I think is a big part of what we've tried to do. We've created a wellness center since COVID, and really different than an employee assistance program, really being all over our campus, ready to receive any of our employees who are struggling with anything, no matter how minor, how large.
Steve, I know it's probably not the case at Facebook, but a lot of workers may feel that their employers didn't do enough to support them during the last year. Many have left the workforce or are hesitant to return to their pre-pandemic jobs. Obviously, Facebook has invested a lot in taking care of its employees. What is the imperative for employers to acknowledge and support family caregivers now from a business perspective?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think most employers would agree that part of our success as a business, whether it's building communities that Facebook does, or any other number of industries, we have to have a select, diverse group of talent. And when we start to fragment who is able to work based on caregiving needs, we start to lose that diverse talent pool. So there's a direct impact on our ability to retain, to grow talent. And in particular, as you mentioned, Nancy, women are permanently leaving the workforce as a result of what's happened. We need women to lead software engineers. We need leading software engineers as women. They bring different perspectives to our platforms in the communities that we try to create online and globally. If we don't have those perspectives, we're not going to reach the community in a way that we believe we should. And so I think it's just telling that the solutions that we have to be broad, they have to be flexible, they have to reach the different types of diverse communities. In particular, even how we define families, how I might define family in my house versus another diverse community. There might be aunts and uncles involved in raising of children. And if we're not building our programs to reach that type of community, we're going to lose in a lot of talent and potentially not being able to attract the talent for us to be successful as a company.
Well, Steve and Robin, thank you so much for joining me. We could talk a lot longer, but our time is up. Appreciate so much your insights and your comments about this very, very important issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nancy, Robin, and Steve, thanks for that discussion and for helping to make critical conversations on family caregiving possible through the 19th Represents. Next, we have a conversation about what it will take to build a sustainable support system for professional and family caregivers. Fatima Goss-Graves is president and CEO of the National Women's Law Center. She's a nationally recognized leader in the fight for gender justice and an expert in law, policy, and culture change. Josephine Kalipeni is the Deputy Director of Family Values at Work. She has worked in family case management and social work, assisting families navigating various public systems. And Cecilia Munoz is the senior advisor for New America. She served as director of the White House Domestic Policy Council under President Obama. Moderating this conversation is the 19th State House's reporter, Barbara Rodriguez.
Hello, and thank you to our panelists for joining us. There are so many ways in which organizations are reshaping the conversation around caregiving. I'd like to hear more from everyone on how their specific work centers caregivers. And Josie, if you'd like to start.
Sure, thanks, Barbara. I'm with Family Values at Work, and we really center our work on the notion of families, particularly Black and Brown families, being able to both work and care. That's instrumental in everything we do, from our policy priorities to really thinking about our strategies, to even thinking about how we endured the pandemic. It was because of a cohort of working family caregivers from our network, from our field partners, who came together to really think about what are the different ways that we can support working families, working organizers, and advocates during the pandemic. And we do this in a couple of different ways. We both do leadership development throughout our network, but we're also advocating for policies that really work for Black and Brown families, because we know that that means those policies will work for everyone. And that's everything from paid family and medical leave to childcare, all centered on what are the best solutions and how will they work for working caregivers.
So I work at an organization in Washington called New America. And we have a bunch of components that are focused on caregiving in a variety of ways, both by elevating how essential caregiving and caregivers are to our ability to function as an economy, to, along with Josie's organization and others, advocating for policy changes that will raise wages for example, childcare providers or home care providers, provide workplace flexibility through policies like paid family leave, a variety of policy changes that we really need, that we've really learned are essential to make our economy go. So we have a component called the Better Life Lab, which really it focuses on doing research and also engaging in storytelling that sort of lifts up what's happening so that it can be more closely seen. We have something called the New Practice Lab, which is doing deep dives into how the government implements policies that affect caregivers to make sure that we can do a much more effective job in delivering policies that we do have, like paid family leave, to make sure that it actually reaches the people it's supposed to reach. And then we have programs that are focused on early childhood education, which focus both on the necessity for children of receiving high quality care and the necessity of making sure that wages and working conditions are what they should be for the people who provide that care. So we go at it in a number of ways, and hopefully we're a good partner to the organizations that are conducting advocacy and are really trying to change the country and you know what we do and who we are and whose work we really honor.
At the National Women's Law Center, we fight for gender justice. We do it in the courts, in our public policy, and in society. And you know, the last year in particular really revealed a couple of critical things that go to the core of our work and the core of our economic recovery as women left the workforce in historic numbers and as our care infrastructure crumbled. So we're working to make the work of care visible through our research and through supporting the stories of caregivers and families in need of care. We're working to tell the stories of women in this time and advocating for policy solutions that will allow for a durable care infrastructure for today, but also for tomorrow in ways that supports the mostly women who provide paid care and the mostly women who provide the unpaid care in this country.
Well, and Fatima, just on some of the points you've made, a question for everybody. I'm curious in what ways you've seen caregivers step up in extraordinary ways during the pandemic, and how, and maybe this seems like an obvious question, but if at all that has contributed to their burnout.
Yeah, well, I have to begin because
at the start of the pandemic, for childcare workers in particular, you saw a lot of folks close immediately and still haven't reopened. So for some folks, they are burnt out in part because their longtime business, their longtime work was eliminated overnight because it was also fragile. But many did stay open, and there's a study out that showed that about 42% of the people who stayed open took on a lot of debt in order to stay afloat at a time where families couldn't afford to pay more. And then there's the unpaid caregivers, mostly mothers, who were sort of in the breach and being our care infrastructure in this period. And we have about 2 million women who left the workforce as a result.
Yeah, I think in addition to what Fatima just said, caregivers have stepped up in extraordinary ways during the pandemic. I think we often talk about what happened during the pandemic as an exposure and, an exposure of what's been happening in the caregiving industry for a long time, and that it's exposed the broken care infrastructure. And the reality is that many caregivers were already in crisis walking into the pandemic. So to think about the resilience and the endurance of caregivers making it through the pandemic, and many who lost loved ones during the pandemic, caregivers and caregiving is just extraordinary in that way. But we can't forget that last year was a huge election year, right? Both at the national level, but also there were significant states where Black women, many care workers, many caregivers showed up to the polls, endured the pandemic, endured caregiving crises to make sure that the political future of our country was centered on the needs of care and caregivers. So even when I think about that as an extraordinary measure, as an extraordinary extra on top of the caregiving resilience and endurance and strength and work of caregivers, it's just phenomenal. And it's partially how we are where we are today, having the multitude of conversations that center the care infrastructure. And I'll just add that we've seen many community Facebook groups pop up, started by caregivers trying to connect people in the communities with resources and services and networks that they already knew about because they had endured caregiving crises. And so they know the environment of their cities, they know the environment of the programs they live, and are now connecting people to what exists. As haphazard, as fractured as it is, caregivers are the ones that know these resources, that know what works, that know what doesn't work. And we're often the connectors during the pandemic. We're often the folks sharing resources in the community, and often the folks taking action when our organizations like ours were having action alerts requiring people to do one more thing to make sure that resources were reaching communities. It was caregivers who were stepping up in those moments.
So I think about what I learned from some of our partners in places like the Service Employees International Union or the National Domestic Workers Alliance, who were reporting that caregivers, especially home care workers, were often very isolated, or nursing home workers were literally risking their lives to do their work, particularly in the early days of the pandemic. And we lost many more than we should have. So for a variety of reasons, but that shouldn't be overlooked. We're talking about people who were doing a heroic thing and who didn't survive it. And because of the nature of the work, because of the lack of protections in their work. So that is the first thing that springs to mind, which is something that caregivers gave, including their lives in the course of this pandemic. So that's absolutely top of mind. And then, as you heard both Fatima and Josie talk about, we know that we lost women in the workforce, that women left the workforce because of the caregiving responsibilities at home, because of the lack of childcare, because of home-based school. And I will say, in the course of my own work, both at New America, and then I was on leave from New America for a period working on the Biden-Harris transition. And there were extraordinary, dedicated people that I was around, and I am sure that's true of my colleagues who are on this call and people all over the country, who were doing heroic work while also monitoring the third grade happening in their living rooms and bouncing somebody else on their laps. And suffering from extraordinary stress and exhaustion from trying to keep their families afloat as they were doing their part to keep the country afloat. And we could really see, quite physically on the screens in front of us, the extent to which the workforce depends, our economy depends, our country depends on the labor of people, and they're usually overwhelmingly women and very, very frequently women of color, who are doing home care work, who are doing childcare work, who are working in nursing homes, and who are doing the hard work at home of keeping their families afloat, and just how much our economy really depends on their labor.
I'm thinking about wanting to ask about federal response, but I also keep thinking to the central theme of this panel, which is caring for the caregivers. And I think even if this is kind of an existential question of who do you think that is supposed to be? Is it the federal government? Is it state legislatures? Is it local governments? And maybe it's a quick response kind of question, but I'm curious what everyone thinks about that.
So I guess I'll start by saying yes to all of it, right? We have learned that our economy really can't go unless we make it possible for women to be in the workforce when they have caregiving responsibilities at home. And I would say for people to be in the workforce when they have caregiving responsibilities at home. And that the caregiving that we depend on in the early childhood sector, in the elder care sector, is essential also to make our economy go, and it should be compensated as such. And that really requires organizing at the community level and by workers themselves. And there's a lot of that's been happening around the country. It requires state responses. My organization is studying a program in Washington state that has created a home care authority, which gives workers in that sector effectively bargaining rights and has had an impact on their wages. That's a state initiative. If you marry state initiatives like that with the resources that are being proposed by the Biden administration, for example, that complete package, the organizing and worker voice, the state authorities, which give them a place from which to bargain, an employer with whom to bargain, and federal resources, all of those things combined can completely change the game for home care workers and create models that we could use also for early childhood education and in other sectors. So yes to all of it. It really needs to be a full court press from government at every level and by people themselves.
And if I could just add to the point that Cecilia made, because that is one of the shifts that's happening in real time that's so important. It is moving it from being a personal problem that families are resolving well or not resolving well, a personal problem for workers to be able to figure out how to do the most important work really in our society on wages that are poverty wages without a lot of job security. So removing it from this idea that these are individual problems that to be worked out well or not to something we all have a stake in, that our federal government has a stake in it, our state and local governments have a stake, our businesses have a stake. So we have been removed from this idea that just solving this one-on-one is going to be the right solution. And now we know that it's going to take a meaningful and significant investment and rules of the road that ensure that workers are not left on their own to fend for themselves.
Yeah, and I would just add to that we are seeing a real shift. I'm thinking about the last few hearings, Fatima, that we've seen on the Hill, where it's not just, you know, the experts and like the way we think about who experts are. It's not just these like a deep level of research experience people coming before members of Congress to discuss the broken caregiving infrastructure and that the impacts of the broken infrastructure on families. But we're actually seeing the experiences of caregivers being put front and center as the experts on both the impact of the broken infrastructure from their own experience, from our own experiences, but also in being the folks that are frontline making the policy demands and the demands from their government. So when I think in addition to the policies that we know we need to see, in addition to the numbers that we know and the impacts of the pandemic, I think the other thing that we all have to be ever so mindful of about the needs of family caregivers all across our country is that they are the experts in their own experiences. They know what works and what doesn't work. And being able to give space and value to their expertise is incredible for our country and is actually what's going to forge the pathway forward to real meaningful solutions that really, really work for families, right? There's some things that, you know, I thought I knew a year ago, and then I talked to families that were caregiving across multiple generations in one household who say to me, you know, that doesn't work that way because of XYZ. And we have to come back to the policy design table and rethink how benefits are administered and what meaningful investments actually look like outside of, you know, not random numbers, because they're all well thought out numbers, but what meaningful investments really look like and what policy and program design look like. But it's because of centering the expertise of people's lived experiences through the broken care infrastructure. And if there's one thing that I'm like, we all need to be saying as loud as possible, is that family caregivers need a continued platform to share their lived experiences and to share what works and what doesn't work, and to have meaningful input and feedback into policy design, into program design. I know all of our organizations on this panel do that incredibly well. I feel like we currently have an administration, have members of Congress who are pausing to say, oh, wait, let's not design this thing and talk about this thing in a vacuum without talking to the folks that will be directly impacted. And I think that's a huge continued need that we need to continue to capitalize on.
I've heard a couple of times the discussion around investment and the importance of investment. And on that note, President Biden has proposed hundreds of billions of dollars to shore up caregiving as part of a larger infrastructure plan. You know, some details remain limited and there are questions about its chances, but, you know, just thinking about what should a sustainable system through the help of the federal government look like to support home and community-based services? And Cecilia, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, so the model that I referred to in Washington State gives me a lot of hope, because it really combines the resources that we need with structures that actually give caregivers themselves the voice and the bargaining power to help determine the conditions of their work, including their wages. And a couple of my colleagues, Cassandra Robertson and Bridget Schulte, just ran a piece a few weeks ago in the New York Times that actually outlined the lives of two home care workers who they're actually nursing home workers who happen to be a mother and daughter, and they live in different states. And because they live in different states, the daughter earns twice the wages compared to her mother. And that has to do with where they live and the fact that the daughter lives in a state which has a home care authority, which has put resources in, as the Biden administration is proposing, to provide more care and to provide quality care, but also created a structure so that workers in the sector have a government entity that they can bargain with. And as a result, wages are higher, and quality is higher, and outcomes are better compared to other states where, as Fatima said, we're talking about poverty wages and terrible conditions and not a lot of job security. So it's an example of how you can combine different goals. Not just, it's not, the resources are tremendously important, but they're by themselves, they're not sufficient, but that you can listen to what's happening in the lives of workers and the lives of the people that they are cared for, and get better outcomes for everybody with the infusion of resources by making sure that those workers are empowered to actually help determine the conditions of their labor. That is a model which can work in other states, It can be a great way to leverage government resources at state level, at the federal level. And it accomplishes multiple goals. So I do think we are, because again, the era that we're living in has exposed so much that was already broken, that was being really held up by the, frankly, power and strength and resilience of a lot of women, mostly women of color, it doesn't have to be that way. And we can change it, and we should, but we all have to be fighting for all of the things, for government engagement, for resources, for structures, and especially for the women that we are talking about to be in the lead.
You know, one of the things that's exciting about what's happening right now is you're seeing the robust dollars put on the table, and both the administration and Congress acknowledging that it's going to take significant investments, but mapping the policies beside it, as Cecilia said. So there's, you know, a number of proposals around supporting child care workers that have been introduced in the House and Senate. And that do a range of things on pay and quality and expanding the number of families who would be eligible. But we're finally actually naming that to do right by workers and to do right by families, because the rub here, frankly, is that a lot of families can't afford to pay more and are already devoting so much of their income to care. We need a third party. And so what is right now pending on the Hill is sort of the details of how to make it work with a robust investment. And as you say, that part of what our challenge is right now is reminding people that the emergency of the pandemic, which was obviously an emergency on so many fronts, it built off a system that was already fragile. And so our task is to set forth something that will be durable over the long haul.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that I think there are, I've definitely heard different journalists and people on the Hill and, you know, different administrators really balk at the price tags that are being put out through different proposals. And the one thing that I always think about is that all of the systems that we're talking about, whether we're talking about home care or systems that impact worker wages, whether we're talking about childcare, these are systems and programs that have been chronically underfunded for decades. So we're not talking about a system that's been in surplus for the last 20 years, and now we're adding $400 billion on top of that. That's not actually where we're starting from. We're starting from programs and systems that have been in deficit for decades. When I think about the national and state Medicaid programs, many state Medicaid programs were already making tough decisions about who to serve and how, because their state budgets for Medicaid were already so chronically underfunded. So when we think about the numbers of what it means to level up before a pandemic, let alone after a pandemic, and then to build on top of leveling up, what is actually needed to create sustainable infrastructure for care, these numbers are actually, they're not that big, you know? I talk to people all the time about saying, you know, if you're coming from a family budget that's already in the deficit and someone gives you twice your paycheck, it's not twice on top of an already stable family budget. Some of that money is actually already eaten up to fill a deficit. And so we're not working with the same numbers that everyone's sort of balking at. And when you talk to families on the ground who have had to make hard decisions, and when we talk to administrators in states who have had to make hard decisions about who's eligible for home care and who's not based on their state budgets, we know that we're coming from behind. And we know that what's being discussed right now from the administration, as we're putting policy language behind it, is really an initial investment. It's an initial investment to get us leveled up, to then really start thinking about what is it that we're building on top of a fortified infrastructure, a fortified foundation for the infrastructure that we need.
Josie, you highlighted a lot of points about sustainability. And it made me think just about dollar-wise, is this enough money? And what does that look like? What does the sustainability in terms of money look like? And so I'm curious what everyone thinks about that.
Yeah, so I often, I feel like we live in a country that gets really scared at big numbers, that gets really scared anytime the word tax is mentioned, no matter what the context is, right? And so I think there's really deep and wide education we have to do about how our programs are currently funded, what it means they do and don't do. And when we really start from there, I often think that this is a great deposit, right? Like the numbers that we're talking about, when we think about $400 billion into a care infrastructure, it's a great deposit into what we actually need in the long term. It's not nearly enough to get us where we need to be. When I think about what the 65 plus population will look like in 2030, will $400 billion today sustain us from now until what we need in 2030? No. Will it teach us a lot in the next 2 to 3 years that will inform the additional investments that we will need, the additional programmatic infrastructure that we will need to actually level up in wages, to do the things that we need to do on delivering services and care in our communities, on the child care front, on supporting workers as they're working in various industries? I think it's a great start. Is it the end? I certainly hope not.
It certainly can't be the end. And that is because we have learned a deep lesson that care is foundational for our families, but also our economy. And so I actually think we're in a transition period where we are setting forth frameworks to ensure that our care infrastructure isn't just underpaying mostly women of color or relying on the unpaid labor of mostly women, that our care infrastructure is actually treated like infrastructure. And so this transition period is going to be one where it's going to take some time to get used to it. That's why it was important that Congress has introduced proposals that are around $700 billion in direct spending on childcare and early learning. We have to get used to the idea, if we say that we want structures that allow families to be able to afford to access care, that allow workers to be paid wages that are dignity wages, and that provide the sort of supports that allow them to scale up along their profession, that is going to be a significant investment, but one that will pay off in ensuring that women can stay in the workforce, that we do not have the shedding of jobs in the millions, that will pay off in the social, emotional, and the development of young people, of children along the way. And that will pay off in our economy overall, because we have learned this year that this is an issue that is an economic imperative, the ability for people to actually have the support to do what they do, which is both engage in care and work.
I couldn't agree more with what both of my colleagues have just said, that in some ways, we've been thinking about the costs in all of the wrong ways. We haven't thought about it in terms of return on investment. We know that resources that we spend, for example, on early childhood education give you something like, the conservatively speaking, $7 of gain for every dollar that you spend. And that doesn't take into account the effects on the economy that you just heard Fatima talk about. Like, this is essentially, if we are interested in a robust economy, it matters that you give this huge chunk of the workforce wages that allow them to be consumers and not just barely make it. And we've gotten a clear empirical lesson on the kind of supports that are necessary in order for women to be in the workforce, right? That childcare needs to be available, elder care needs to be available. If we're going to have everybody participating in the economy to begin with, in order to have the kind of robust economy that we need. So this is not just a question of, are we throwing money at providing a service, but rather, what is the actual infrastructure that we need in order to make our economy go? what are the actual investments that we need in order to make sure that we have as healthy an economy as possible. So I think in some ways the questions that some policymakers have been asking about costs are focusing on all of the wrong things. And again, we have an opportunity because really so much has been laid bare in the course of the last year. We can see things which have been true for a long time, but which had been hidden, and they're not hidden anymore. Like we can't be who we expect to be as a nation with a robust economy without these structures in place.
Sometimes when I talk to different experts on caregiving and childcare, and they talk about how the solutions have to be holistic and it's not just one thing. And I'm curious what is missing from the conversation when we talk about the emotional and physical labor that goes into caregiving. And if Josie, if you want to start.
Yeah, actually, it's a great point and builds off what Cecilia just said. The one thing that I think is definitely missing, well, maybe there's two. The one thing that I think is definitely missing from the conversation is the reality that without a meaningful investment and meaningful reform in the care infrastructure, we're continuing to set up generations of families, especially Black and Brown families, but really all families, to age into poverty. I feel like I come from a family who, in air quotes, has done everything right, right? I, went to college, got a good degree, got a good job afterwards. I've gone into, really good jobs after that. My family is really close. We lost my dad last year, but we're in these situations where my parents need additional support and one of us has to figure it out. And it better be the person with the most flexible job whose income won't take a hit. And we're constantly pulling together our financial resources to make sure that the care of my parents are met. But that means that I'm not saving into my future, that I'm making delayed financial decisions about property investments or buying a home or starting a family because the money's not in the bank account. And this is in a situation where by most American standards, right, I've done the everything right checkbox. And yet our economy and our systems are set up in such a way where even if you do everything right, without the additional investments in our care infrastructure, we're setting up generations upon generations to age into poverty, to get to a retirement age without a retirement infrastructure, without the care they need that's culturally competent, affordable, and quality, and still having to make tough decisions, whether it's early on because of a disability or whether it's later in life because of age and disability. And so the idea that what we have to think about is just the 400 billion of right now, is just the infrastructure of right now, and not the idea of audaciously changing the economic trajectory of multiple generations. That's what we're talking about doing. We're not talking about care infrastructure. We're not talking about $400 billion. We're talking about changing the economic trajectory of generations of families. And that sort of like deep, that deep understanding of that is really missing when we really narrow this down to numbers and politics, right? And so that's one thing that I think is missing. And then I know Fatima hears my soapbox all the time too. I work in the, specifically been working on paid family and medical leave, and really also on home and community-based services and care. Oftentimes the conversation can really center on just parental care. And in some ways it's good because then everybody's talking about it, right? And there's a level of value in being able to talk about it like that. But as a childless working adult, all of the things we're talking about, I need to for many different reasons. And there's a subset of my own girlfriends, for example, who are Black working, childless, single, amazing women, but oftentimes hear the national discourse happening in a parental only kind of way and think that they're left out until we're talking about it. And I'm saying, no, when you need to go home to take care of your mom, or when your sister gets sick, this is about you too, And so that would be the other thing that I'm constantly thinking about, is that we need this for parents, for sure. That's been made so clear through the pandemic. But as a childless, working Black woman, we need this for me, we need this for me too. So those are the two things that I feel like are sort of silent and nascent in the current conversation and missing.
Well, the only other thing I would add is that I think we have to constantly remind everyone that care work is physically and emotionally taxing work. It requires a lot of love, and it requires tremendous skill. And I think we forget that in part because it has been so undervalued and so underpaid, or just unpaid, because it builds off a legacy of slavery where it was not paid. But it is tremendously expensive because it is so taxing, because it requires such skill. And I'm having this conversation. I'm so glad, Josie, you raised the continuum of care. This issue was such a personal issue for me as the granddaughter of two different domestic workers, but who also is listening for my children running in circles on the other side of my door right now as I have my own personal care challenges. It is something that has been brought to light in such important ways.
The one thing I would add to that, and I appreciate this conversation so much, is that we're starting to enter into a policy conversation because of census data shows that our birth rate is declining, and which makes me think, so people are puzzling over, so why is that happening? And it makes me think, well, like ask any woman in America and they could tell you, we don't have an infrastructure to support families who are having kids. And as Josie just pointed out, it's not just about people who are parents, it's also people who have parents, right? That is a major part also of our caregiving need. So like these are not challenges that happen in isolation. They have effect all the way up and down the economy. And so for the folks in the business sector who are really worried that our birth rate is plummeting and they don't quite know where the workers of tomorrow are going to come from, there you can draw a direct line between that and the infrastructure that people need in order to be able to work, including childcare, including a good school system, and including elder care. Like this is not altruism that we're talking about here. These are things which make our economy go.
I'm going to squeeze in one more question, but consider it the 30-second response from everybody. What is one actionable thing you want viewers to walk away with from today's panel? And anybody can go first.
I'll start. These are not intractable problems. I mean, I worry that by raising all of this, that it feels weighty, it feels like something that isn't solvable, and it is utterly solvable. There are other nations in the world that have figured this out, and some of them are nations that have fewer resources than we have. I have, concluded for all of the challenges that we face, these are not intractable problems, and therefore any individual has the capacity to make a difference on this stuff. There are people who are organizing around it. There are movements. You have legislators. You have in your state. And at the federal level, there is no reason that you can't help lift your part of this challenge so that we get to answers here. They are available. We just have to fight for them.
So we've learned that care is a public good, and we cannot return to the very fragile and inequitable state that we had going into the pandemic. We have the opportunity, and actually we have an imperative to do something different in the future.
Yeah, and I would just add to all of that we're no longer in a moment where our elected officials can tear up what they solve first, because that is not how families experience these issues. We don't get to pick whether what we're going to do today is show up for our families or go to work. And so the idea that sort of already starting to bubble up in national discourse, that let's do this first, then we'll do childcare, then we'll do home care, then we'll do wages, hasn't worked for us for decades, didn't work for us, and didn't stand ground in the pandemic. And now is the time to center what Cecilia said, that these are solvable issues, that they can be solved in a combined, comprehensive, wraparound, full circle way. And I would be remiss if I didn't tell people that you should connect with an advocacy organization, connect with a movement like Family Values at Work, who, we all really believe that fighting for the crumbs and pitting our issues against each other is not the way that we're going to forge our wins moving forward, and that we are committed as national organizations and partnerships and as advocacy and movement spaces, that we're fighting for the comprehensive needs of our families and no longer thinking about whether worker wages go first or whether childcare infrastructure gets built first, right? That we're going for the whole bakery. We don't want a slice of the pie. We want the whole pie, and we want the bakery. And to really connect with movements and advocacy organizations that where your voice can be powerful and can be used to win the things that we need for families.
Well, that's all the time we have today. Fatima, Josie, Cecilia, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima, Josie, and Cecilia. Now we are going behind the story with the 19th's healthcare reporter Shefali Luthra to hear firsthand from Adara Benjamin, a fourth-generation caregiver, on the challenges of home healthcare. Shefali?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Emily. Adara, it's great to talk to you and to hear from you firsthand about what your experience as a caregiver has been like. And I was hoping just to start, you told us before, right? You are not the first caregiver in your family. And I'd love to learn a bit about how you came to do this work and what it means to you personally.
Thanks. So I am not the first person to do this care work. My great-grandmother used to take care of my great-great-grandmother and my great-uncle. My grandmother was a CNA at a nursing home. And my mom, as of the last 21 years, has been a residential care worker for the state. So it has been, in a sense, ingrained in me. I've watched every strong Black woman I know take care of our family and others' family. So it basically shifted my gears to make sure that I can do the same and provide the same care work and essential work that they did for others. That's basically how I got into it, and in the sense of everything that I do.
And maybe thinking through, right, what your work looks like, how would you sort of describe for me and for the audience what a typical day on the job usually is?
Ooh, okay, so I wake up about 5:30, 6 o'clock, get myself ready. I would leave out at 7, be at work at 8. By then, I am getting my client up. I have to get her dressed. I have to wash her up. I have to brush her teeth, wash her face, toilet her. And then by the time we've gotten dressed, we have finally got ready to sit at the table. Now I have to prepare her breakfast, whatever she would like for that day. I have to make sure it's cut properly for her to actually feed herself. And then I have to bring her food, make sure she has everything situated so that she can feed herself properly. During that time when she's eating, now I'm going back in the room, cleaning up all of the mess I've created as far as getting her ready for that day, making the bed, just making sure the room is clean before I walk out. Once I've walked out, I am getting her ready and cleaned up from breakfast to get ready for class. Once class is started, I am her partner. So if they are exercising, we're exercising. If they're drawing, we're drawing. If they're crafting, we're crafting. And we stay in class, I want to say from 10 until 5. During then, it's a long class. So during then, we may have taken about a 30-minute break. We still have to go to the bathroom. That morning, while I'm preparing breakfast, I've already made lunch. So during that break, we'll eat lunch, sit down to calm down from the exercise and everything we did that morning. Then we get back to class. So about 5 o'clock, I am originally getting her ready for bed. So it's another shower, clothing again, and then I'm getting ready for dinner. I'm making dinner for the next 2 hours. So by 7 o'clock, when her mom actually gets off work and comes home, dinner is made. She's already ate lunch and breakfast. She's already dressed, bathed. She's just basically ready to lay down. And then by then, I'll be heading home, which I'll possibly get home, I want to say 8:30, 9 o'clock at the latest. And that is a 12-hour day for me, but there has been longer across the board. Care work goes beyond just a 12-hour day of taking care. And I only have one client now. I've had 4 clients at one time. So it's not unusual to have a 16-hour day and to work 16 hours, long, hard hours each day.
Wow. And remind me, the client you work with now, how long have you been working together?
So we have been working gratefully at the beginning of the pandemic. I ended up losing 3 clients. So I was in between jobs at the time, and I met her, I want to say March of last year. So I've been working since the very beginning of the pandemic.
I'm so struck by how involved and how full your day is and how your work is. And I think one thing that you have spoken about and sort of alluded to in your remarks is that there is an element to this that is a labor of love.
Yes.
And I'd love to hear, but yeah, what are the things that you care about the most or that you love most in your job?
Honestly, I love it all. But the thing that I do love most is creating the independence for my clients. Care work basically is to create the independence for clients or help them with things that they may be dependent upon you for or independent from. So having a chance to connect with clients or connect with people to give them a sense of independency is something that I don't think I can ever take back. Learning to give care to people so that they know I care about them and that they understand that this work is essential. And that I know for a fact that they need me and they know I know they need me. So I have to make sure that everything I do is in their best interest. So I love making sure that they feel independent or feel as though they can do something.
Mm-hmm. What are the hard parts? And are there any specific times when you've been really struck by the challenges of this work?
The hardest part of this work, I honestly will say it's the lack of pay, the lack of protection, and the lack of respect. I think the reason why it's a challenge is because, again, this work is essential. People need this work. When it comes to a care worker, we leave out of our homes to make sure we go into other people's homes so that the people that live there can go and do their jobs. So understanding that and seeing how we play an essential role in other people's life, whether it be the husband of an ailing woman who happens to be a doctor or the wife of a firefighter. We come in to make sure that the firefighter or the doctor or the lawyer can go and do their jobs. But what we lack is the protection. What we lack is the respect for the work we do. What we lack is the pay. We don't benefit from what we do. We don't have benefits. You have to really love what you do, because your pay doesn't reflect it. The respect doesn't reflect it, and we're not protected. So that shows that, in a sense, that we feel like we're not essential.
One thing that I think maybe could help illustrate what you're talking about. I mean, tell me about what working in the past year has been like. What were the parts of the pandemic that changed your work, and things that maybe made it easier, but often I would gather made it much harder?
So I would say, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, when there was no PPE, when there was the craze of trying to find places to go to, it was that sense of hopelessness that goes back to being protected. I didn't have anyone to turn to. The agencies in home care and in healthcare in general weren't giving a lot of information to help the workers. So we had to find our own type of protection. We have to create our own sense of security. And seeing as though we go in and care for people, why is it though we're the ones that are least cared about? It's the fact that during the pandemic, we were losing pay. There was no sense of protection to help us with our pay. There was no way to possibly find clients without sending a sense of urgency of being contaminated by the virus, or being possibly a carrier who is asymptomatic and passes it on to your client. So it's just the fact that we had no sense of security, no respect, we weren't protected, and our pay didn't even reflect it, because we are still fighting for COVID pay as this day. So it's a lot that goes for this.
When you say that your pay was affected, do you mean just by losing clients, or were there other things that changed, sort of the economic circumstances?
No, I just mean by losing clients specifically due to the pandemic and the anxiety and the stress that it caused on not only the workers going to work unprotected trying to find PPE, but also the clients who have the people coming in with the lack of PPE feeling unprotected.
How did you all go about getting PPE? Was it just going to the store and seeing what they had, or did someone help you get it, or?
So no, it was not that easy. I wish it was. God, I spent hours looking for hand sanitizer, Lysol, mask. At the time, there were no stores. We were dealing with rioting and everything, so there weren't any stores around us. So you would have to travel maybe 15 miles to get to a store that possibly may have hand sanitizer, could possibly have gloves. And if they don't, you may have to travel even further. I thankfully have a mother who works in care, and she had supplied on gloves. Unfortunately, we didn't have masks, but we had hand sanitizer for years. So it helped in a sense, but we still were left to find it on our own. So however you found it is how you got it.
How far would you say you or your colleagues had to travel to find something like masks?
Honestly, if I would give an estimate, I'd say maybe 20 miles at best from just your home or possibly your client's home.
One thing that I think is also interesting thinking about the pandemic and sort of recognizing the work that you do, right, is, I mean, healthcare workers were in theory prioritized for COVID vaccines. Is that something that affected you? How were you able to go about getting vaccinated?
Thankfully, honestly, I can say that my union, SEIU, has helped and provided many of places where workers can go and get vaccinated for free. Thankfully, because there were not a lot of options or places where you can go get vaccinated. There weren't any people trying to get you out there saying, hey, we have vaccinations, you can come in. So I would accredit that to my union for helping the workers and fighting for the workers so that we do feel protected in a sense.
When did you get your first COVID vaccine?
I have not gotten my vaccine yet. I am actually scheduled to get it in 3 days.
That's very exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
One thing that I want to talk about that's kind of forward-looking is thinking about what the government can or should, to your opinion, do to improve support for caregivers. And this is something the president has talked about, but what kind of changes would you want to see economically, socially, culturally, any which way to address what you think is important?
I honestly would like to start by showing that this work is essential, understanding that what we do is important. I want workers that go into people's homes to care for them to feel cared for. Finding ways to invest in what we do, coming to understand that healthcare is going to be forever. Care work is going to be forever. We're all going to get older. We're all going to need a care worker. So understanding that and taking the opportunity to invest in something that we're all going to need is the biggest step. It would trickle down to being able, as a Black woman, to save, to make sure that I am taken care of. My transportation to work is not in question, and I'm not balancing between getting to work and paying for food in the home, or making sure that we have the medications we need for that month. It's an opportunity to show workers that your work is valued and you are essential, you are important. It gives us the respect and pay that we're looking for, and in a sense that we feel protected.
I know that putting a number on this can be difficult. Are there, I don't know, is there like a baseline minimum pay that should, to your mind, be available to all care workers? Should there be certain benefits that aren't universal that you would like to see?
Healthcare is a benefit that I feel like all care workers should have in general. You give care, you should get care. That's like the most obvious thing. Baseline wages for people, I feel like across the board, care workers should at least be making, if not $25 an hour, at least $20 an hour, because the work is tiring. It's day in, it's day out. My story is 12 hours, but home care work can range from a 24-hour day to stay in. You could live in with your client. So understanding that this job, though it is rewarding to understand that you're helping other people, it is tiring to take care of yourself, your family, and another family. So getting that sense of care when you care is what I think would help people to want to stay in this field. Because if we don't get benefits that make it worthwhile, if I am sick, I can't, I may not be able to go to the doctor if I don't have health care. Thankfully, again, my union provides things like that because they are looking out for the workers. But it's the little things like that that I think need to be invested in and understood.
Have you ever thought about having to leave the industry because of these sorts of challenges you're talking about?
No. What I did instead, crazy, and I never thought about this, but I never thought about getting a different job. I more so thought about getting more clients. Mm-hmm. I think because of the way that I have been brought up and seeing my role models as Black women being the caregivers that they are, I've never really seen any other option. So being able to possibly get a different client, to stay in it, to make ends meet in a sense, is what drove me. So I've never had a thought to leave ever.
Adara, are there things that you want the audience or just people in general to know about the work that you do and about care at large and sort of why you think this is important?
I want people to know that home care work is the backbone of the healthcare industry in general, because like I said, if the wife of a doctor or the wife of a lawyer needs care work, they can't go to work without someone like me or myself coming into the house and making sure that their loved one is cared for in the best way possible. I want people to understand why it is essential, what we do is important, and people depend on us. and why they depend on us, understanding what we do day in and day out, why we work 16-hour shifts, why we do and are asking for $20 an hour. We're not just saying we deserve it, we work for it, and we work tirelessly day in and day out for it. So I want people to value the work that we give, because we value the work that we give. And if we didn't, we possibly wouldn't be doing it.
You mentioned earlier, and I think this dovetails into that idea, the notion of respect. What would that look like? How do people talk about care in a way that to you would sort of signify that they understand that value?
Actually seeing people, I don't want to say thanking me, because in a sense, I don't need to be thanked for something that I chose to do. I want to do this, but valuing us, understanding that we are working. And I honestly, it depends on, like, if we're talking about the government, I think the best way that they can do is pay us correctly, pay us according to what we do. Our family, I can't say that the families that we work for don't value us, because I have gotten a lot of thank yous. I do feel a part of the family. I just want people to not look at us as babysitters. I want people to look at us as workers, because we are workers. We are important. This job is just not where you go in and sit in someone's house and just watch them. No, I'm making sure you eat. I'm making sure your house is clean. I'm making sure you're clean clothes, you've washed up. So I want people to know and take the time to look at us and, in a sense, yes, say thank you. Not verbally, but give us the recognition that we deserve. Understand that care work is important. Tell other people how important care work is. Word of mouth is important, because you never know where it may spread to.
I think this was really helpful, and I am so grateful that you took the time, given all that you do. And thank you for joining us. I think this was a really informative conversation.
Thank you for the opportunity, especially to spread my message of the importance of work we do.
Thank you, Shefali, and thank you, Adara, for sharing your story and extraordinary experience with the 19th. What an incredible day. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us for the 19th Represents Building a Caregiving Economy for All, especially those of you tuning in from home. A special thanks again to our founding sponsor, AARP, and to our supporting sponsors, Pivotal Ventures and RAND Corporation. If you missed any part of the program today or you want to rewatch, visit 19thnews.org/events. If you liked what you saw today, we'd love it if you join us as members of the 19th. As a nonprofit newsroom, the support of our members keeps our journalism free for all to read and our events free to attend. Even $19 helps. You can make a gift at 19thnews.org/donate. We hope to see you on June 17th for our next Live with the 19th event on the future of the Black Lives Matter movement. And a reminder that you can get notified about future events by signing up for our free newsletter at 19thnews.org/subscribe. We look forward to welcoming you to the 19th family, and we'll see you at our next event.